Cambodia's long and complex history begins far earlier than the rise of kingdoms or the carving of stone temples. It begins with the land itself, a landscape shaped by monsoon rains, fertile floodplains, and the steady flow of the Great Mekong River. Long before the appearance of written records or royal inscriptions, this region supported communities who gradually transformed the environment into one of the most important cultural centers of mainland Southeast Asia. To understand the later achievements of the Khmer world, we must first understand these earliest chapters. Archaeologists believe that humans were present in what is now Cambodia tens of thousands of years ago. The earliest evidence comes from stone tools discovered in caves such as Lang Speen in the northwest of the country. These tools, dating to the prehistoric period known as the Paleolithic era, show that small groups of hunter-gatherers moved across the region, living off forest resources and the rich waterways that would later support entire civilizations. Life was simple, but these early communities established the first human connection to the landscape that would one day form the heart of the Khmer Empire. Over time, as the climate shifted and the monsoon system stabilized, the region became more hospitable for long-term settlement. During the Neolithic period, communities began to adopt agriculture. Findings from sites in Cambodia and neighboring areas show clear evidence of early rice cultivation. Rice did not simply become a staple food, it also encouraged people to settle more permanently near water sources. With settled life came early forms of social organization, as families and extended groups managed land, water, and crops together. By the Bronze Age, excavations reveal a noticeable increase in social complexity. Burial sites along the Mekong and in the Cardamom Mountains show people being interred with tools, pottery, ornaments, and sometimes bronze objects such as axes or bracelets. These finds hint at the emergence of specialized roles, trade networks, and differences in status. Communities were no longer just surviving, they were creating traditions, managing resources, and engaging with neighboring groups across long distances. One of the most significant influences on the region during this era came from broader patterns of migration and cultural exchange. Linguists and genetic research suggest that ancestors of the Khmer people belonged to the larger Austroasiatic language family. Groups speaking early forms of these languages spread across mainland Southeast Asia, bringing with them agricultural knowledge and distinct cultural practices. These migrations were not rapid or violent. Instead, they unfolded gradually over centuries, weaving together various communities into a cultural tapestry that would eventually give rise to the Khmer identity. The landscape itself played an essential role in shaping early societal development. The Mekong River, one of the longest rivers in Asia, served as a natural highway. It connected distant communities, allowed trade in goods like salt, fish, and forest products, and supported a rich ecosystem that provided food throughout the year. To the west, the Tonle Sap Lake became a remarkable seasonal engine of fertility. Each year, the monsoon forced the Mekong to reverse the flow of the Tonle Sap River, flooding the lake and filling it with fish and nutrients. This phenomenon created one of the world's most productive freshwater fisheries. Even in prehistoric times, this extraordinary cycle drew human settlement and offered a stable foundation for growing populations. Because these early communities had no writing system, much of what we know about their lives comes from material remains. Pottery fragments show advances in cooking and storage. Stone tools reveal improvements in agriculture and hunting. The spread of bronze technology hints at trade far beyond Cambodia's borders, linking the region to networks that stretched into present-day Vietnam, Thailand, and Laos. Every artifact adds another piece to the story of how Southeast Asian societies evolved from small mobile groups into more settled and organized communities. By the early centuries of the first millennium BCE, these societies had grown in number and complexity. Archaeological findings indicate the formation of small chiefdoms, each controlling territories around rivers, hills, or fertile plains. These early political units did not yet resemble formal states, but they did show a growing capacity for shared labor, defense, and ritual practices. Leaders likely emerged based on their ability to manage resources, mediate disputes, or maintain connections with spiritual forces believed to inhabit the natural world. Religion during this time was rooted in animism. People believed that spirits lived in mountains, forests, rivers, and even stones. Caves became ritual sites, and certain landscapes gained sacred significance. This worldview would later merge with imported belief systems, transforming into the elaborate spiritual foundation of the Khmer Empire. But its roots lay in simple ideas: that the land was alive, that ancestors could guide the living, and that harmony with nature was essential for survival. Trade expanded as communities grew. Along the coasts and river routes, early Cambodians exchanged goods with traders from distant regions. Shells and beads found far inland show the extent of these connections. Some of these trade networks linked to the larger maritime system known as the Austronesian Sphere, centered on seafaring peoples who moved through the islands of Southeast Asia. Others connected to mainland groups who exchanged metals, salt, and agricultural goods. Through trade, early Cambodians encountered new ideas, materials, and technologies that slowly reshaped their world. By the late centuries of the first millennium BCE, these gradual changes were beginning to accumulate. Settlements became larger. Social hierarchies became more pronounced. Tools became more sophisticated. With the arrival of iron technology, agricultural productivity increased. Larger harvests meant more stable populations, and those populations could support leaders, craftsmen, and specialized workers. This slow evolution set the stage for the dramatic leap that would occur in the following centuries: the emergence of organized kingdoms and the beginning of recorded history. Although we cannot name specific individuals from this distant time, we can still see their legacy in the archaeological record and in the continuity of cultural practices. The ancestors of the Khmer laid the groundwork for later developments in agriculture, water management, social organization, and spiritual life. They shaped the cultural landscape long before monumental temples or royal inscriptions. Their efforts allowed later societies to flourish in ways that would astonish historians and travelers centuries later. One of the most fascinating aspects of Cambodia's prehistoric development is how well-suited the region was for future state formation. The combination of fertile plains, predictable monsoons, abundant rivers, and rich fisheries created a natural environment for dense populations. Civilizations around the world, from the Nile Valley to Mesopotamia, emerged in similar river-based settings. Cambodia shared many of these geographical advantages, but with a uniquely Southeast Asian character shaped by monsoon cycles and tropical biodiversity. Environmental adaptability also played a crucial role. As populations grew and village networks expanded, early communities learned to manage the seasonal floods of the Tonle Sap and the Mekong. Instead of being overwhelmed by the monsoon, they adapted their agricultural rhythms to it. This understanding of water management would later evolve into the sophisticated hydraulic engineering that powered Angkor's rise. But its earliest foundations can be traced to these prehistoric farmers who learned to read the patterns of the land. The rise of the first organized states in the region that would become Cambodia marks a dramatic turning point in Southeast Asian history. After millennia of gradual development in farming, trade, and social organization, the early centuries of the first millennium of the Common Era saw the emergence of the first recognized kingdom in the area, Funan. This new political structure signaled the beginning of diplomacy, international trade, monumental building, and written culture. It was a world far more complex than anything that had existed before, and it laid the groundwork for all later Cambodian history. Funan was not a kingdom known through its own written records, because its inhabitants left behind no surviving texts from that era. Instead, what we know comes largely from outside observers, especially Chinese envoys, travelers, and historians who recorded their impressions. Their writings offer a rare glimpse into what was happening in mainland Southeast Asia at a time when many societies in the region were only beginning to consolidate into recognizable states. Chinese chronicles describe Funan as a prosperous trading kingdom with considerable power along the coastline of the Gulf of Thailand. These records begin around the 1st century of the Common Era, although Funan itself likely emerged somewhat earlier. By the time Chinese emissaries encountered it, Funan was already an established participant in long-distance maritime exchange. It had developed ports that facilitated contact between merchants from the Indian subcontinent and those from East Asia. These routes formed part of a larger system, sometimes called the Early Maritime Silk Road, a network of trade that moved goods, ideas, and people across great stretches of ocean. One of the most frequently cited stories about Funan's origins comes from Chinese accounts describing a foreigner named Kaundinya. According to the tale, he traveled from the Indian subcontinent and married a local queen named Soma. The marriage symbolized the fusion of foreign and local traditions, marking the beginning of a new ruling line. While the story cannot be taken literally, it reflects important historical truths. The region was deeply connected to Indian cultural and political ideas, and early states relied on both indigenous traditions and international influence to shape their identity. This contact with the Indian world did not mean direct colonization. Rather, it involved the selective adoption of ideas that local elites found useful. Among the most important of these were concepts of kingship, written scripts, and religious systems such as Hinduism and early forms of Buddhism. These influences helped transform loosely organized agricultural chiefdoms into centralized states with established hierarchies. In Funan, leaders began to articulate their authority in new ways. They adopted Indian-inspired titles, used Sanskrit vocabulary in religious and political contexts, and built sanctuaries to honor Hindu deities like Shiva and Vishnu. These shifts were not superficial imitations. They became the intellectual framework that legitimized rulers and shaped the cultural landscape of mainland Southeast Asia for centuries. Archaeological evidence helps fill in details about Funan's economic base. Excavations at sites such as Angkor Wat and Ok Eo reveal sophisticated systems of canals, moats, and embankments. These waterworks demonstrate an ability to organize large-scale labor and manage landscapes, a hallmark of early state formation. Funan's elites understood that control over water meant control over agriculture and trade. As a result, they invested heavily in managing rivers and marshlands that surrounded their settlements. OCEO in particular offers compelling evidence of Funan's participation in global trade. Artifacts found there include glass beads, Roman coins, jewelry shaped by Indian techniques, and ceramics from China. The presence of these items shows that Funan served as a major link between East Asia and South Asia. Some goods may have passed through its ports without ever being used locally, but others were integrated into local society, influencing art, dress, and ritual practices. This intense engagement with the outside world gave Funan an economic advantage. The kingdom became wealthy by acting as a middle point in maritime trade and by controlling inland routes along the Mekong Delta. Rice production supported its population, while imported goods added prestige to the ruling elite. As wealth flowed into the region, rulers were able to maintain armies, build public works, and support priests and scholars who gave ideological structure to the kingdom's power. The administration of Funan appeared to be hierarchical but flexible. Chinese sources mention that the kingdom had officials responsible for different tasks, including collecting taxes and organizing labor. They describe rulers who sent embassies to China, carrying gifts and pledges of loyalty in exchange for recognition and diplomatic connections. These missions were essential because they placed Funan on the international stage. For a developing state, such recognition was a powerful tool for securing legitimacy. Diplomatic ties with China also opened avenues for cultural exchange. Chinese observers recorded details about Funan's religious practices, clothing, crops, and local customs. They noted that the people practiced both Hindu rites and forms of Buddhist worship, showing early examples of the region's long tradition of religious blending. Their descriptions highlight a society that embraced multiple influences without losing its own identity. Despite its strengths, Funan was not a single, tightly controlled empire. It appears to have been more of a network of territories and trading centers linked by allegiance, trade interests, and shared culture. Local rulers likely governed their own areas while acknowledging the prestige or ritual authority of Funan's central elite. The kingdom's power could expand or contract depending on economic conditions, internal alliances, and the strength of individual leaders. Over time, Funan's political structure began to change. By the 6th century of the Common Era, the kingdom entered a period of decline. The reasons were complex and interconnected. One factor may have been the changing patterns of maritime trade. As shipping routes evolved, some ports grew more important, while others diminished. Economic centers could shift quickly in response to these changes, and Funan may have struggled to maintain its dominance. Another factor involved inland developments. Communities located farther up the Mekong River began to grow in power, forming polities that did not depend as heavily on coastal trade. These inland societies controlled fertile agricultural areas and could draw support from villagers who relied on rice cultivation rather than maritime commerce. Over time, these inland forces gained confidence and sought more autonomy. Chinese sources record that Funan was eventually replaced by a kingdom called Chenla, which emerged from the interior. This transition represents a major shift in regional power. The focus moved from coastal trade centers to inland agrarian regions, where control over land and water became more important than access to sea routes. The rise of Chenla marks the end of Funan's era, but many of Funan's cultural and political foundations continued to influence later states. The decline of Funan did not erase its role in history. Instead, it left behind several crucial legacies. First, it demonstrated that organized statehood was possible in the region, providing a model for later kingdoms. Second, it introduced writing, religious traditions, and administrative practices that would evolve into the cultural framework of the Khmer Empire. Third, it connected mainland Southeast Asia to the wider world, forging pathways of communication and exchange that would enrich the region for centuries. The transition from Funan to Chenla represents one of the most important shifts in early mainland Southeast Asian history. It marks the moment when political power moved away from the coastal trade world into the interior river valleys and upland plains that would eventually support the rise of the Khmer Empire. This era, stretching across several centuries, is a story of changing geography, shifting economic priorities, and the gradual emergence of new political identities. While Funan flourished along the coasts and marshlands, Chenla grew from the inland agricultural heartlands and redefined the direction of Cambodian history. By the early centuries of the first millennium of the Common Era, Funan had built a reputation as a successful trading state. Its coastal cities connected merchants from India, China, and the wider region. Yet the very strength of Funan, its maritime focus, became a limitation as new inland societies developed. These inland groups relied not on maritime trade, but on rice cultivation, river control, and expanding networks of villages tied together by shared language and cultural practices. Over time, these interior communities formed political centers that grew increasingly confident in their independence and ambition. The area where Chenla first emerged lies in what is now northern Cambodia and southern Laos, near the upper Mekong River and its tributaries. This region was home to fertile agricultural lands and strategic river routes. Archaeological findings show that communities here had been developing for centuries, building irrigation systems, producing metal tools, and participating in long-distance trade in a more limited but stable manner. Unlike Funan, which relied heavily on the shifting patterns of international commerce, these inland societies depended largely on agriculture and the steady rhythms of the monsoon seasons. One of the earliest inland leaders associated with Chenla in historical records is a figure named Jayavarman. Chinese chronicles mention Chenla as a rising power led by ambitious rulers who expanded their influence over neighboring areas. While precise details of Jayavarman's reign are limited, he is traditionally credited with unifying nearby territories and challenging Funan's authority. His rise did not occur through a sudden military conquest, but through a gradual accumulation of regional power, alliances, and the support of local elites who saw opportunity in aligning with inland forces. Following Jayavarman's time, another significant ruler named Jayavarman continued this process of consolidation. Inscriptions found in later centuries refer to him as a king who established control over large parts of what had once been Funan's sphere of influence. He built new centers of power, some of which may have been located at sites like Sambor Pre Coup, an important city known for its temple complexes and distinct architectural style. This site, surrounded by thick forests and fed by river systems, served as one of the earliest capitals of an increasingly unified Chenla state. Sambor Pre Coup's temples stand as silent witnesses to Chenla's cultural priorities. Built with sandstone and brick, they display early forms of the architectural ideas that would later blossom at Angkor. The temples include octagonal towers, intricate carvings, and shrines dedicated to Hindu deities. These features reflect the spread of Indian religious and artistic influences that arrived earlier during Funan's era, but were now being adapted and reinterpreted by inland rulers. The people of Chenla were not simply inheriting ideas, they were reshaping them. Religious transformation was one of Chenla's defining characteristics. Hinduism became the primary state religion, with Shiva often taking precedence in royal worship. Rulers used Shiva's divine authority to legitimize their own positions, claiming to serve as intermediaries between the sacred and the earthly realms. This ideology played a key role in strengthening centralized power. As temples became symbols of political authority, they also became centers for ritual performances, land distribution, and community gatherings. Chenla's political structure, however, was not as stable or centralized as the later Khmer Empire. While rulers sought to expand their authority, the region's geography and social patterns made complete unification difficult. Mountain ranges, dense forests, and river systems created natural boundaries that encouraged the development of local principalities. These local leaders maintained their own identities and loyalties, even as they recognized the authority of Chenla's kings. This loose political organization would later contribute to the kingdom's division. The Chinese records, one of the few written sources for this period, describe Chenla as a land-based kingdom that eventually replaced Funan as the dominant power in the region. Chinese envoys reported that Chenla abandoned the coastal orientation of Funan and focused instead on agriculture and inland trade. They also noted that Chenla sent tribute missions to China, continuing the diplomatic traditions established earlier. These missions were important not just symbolically, but also practically, because they connected Chenla to a wider world and reinforced the legitimacy of its rulers. Yet Chenla's strength was not permanent. By the late 6th or early 7th century of the Common Era, the kingdom began experiencing internal fragmentation. Instead of remaining a unified polity, Chenla split into two major regions, Land Chenla and Water Chenla. This division, recorded in Chinese documents, highlights the deep geographical and cultural differences within the kingdom. Land Chenla, situated in the northern uplands and plateau areas, relied heavily on rice agriculture and inland trade. Its communities were more isolated, making them less reliant on maritime networks. Water Chenla, on the other hand, occupied the southern lowlands and delta regions, where people lived among rivers, canals, and wetlands. These populations were more connected to coastal trade routes and maintained economic and cultural ties that resembled those of earlier Funan. The split between Land and Water Chenla reflects the long-standing tension between inland and coastal centers of power. It also illustrates the complexity of governing a region with diverse landscapes and varied economic systems. No single ruler was able to maintain stable authority over the entire kingdom. As a result, Chenla entered a period of political decentralization. Despite these divisions, both parts of Chenla continued to develop the cultural and religious foundations inherited from earlier eras. Temples multiplied across the landscape, inscriptions recorded the deeds of kings and local elites, and new artistic styles emerged that blended indigenous creativity with Indian inspiration. The land was becoming a patchwork of religious sanctuaries, agricultural villages, and small courts, all linked by networks of trade, ritual exchange, and occasional rivalry. One of Chenla's most enduring legacies is its transition from reliance on international maritime trade to the careful management of inland resources. This shift was crucial for the later development of the Khmer Empire, which would build its strength not on coastal ports, but on the mastery of water control, rice cultivation, and priestly-supported kingship. Chenla's rulers experimented with forms of governance, religious expression, and architectural planning that set the stage for the monumental achievements of later centuries. Moreover, the fragmentation of Chenla, while often portrayed as a sign of weakness, played a role in shaping the political landscape that Jayavarman II would eventually reunify. The existence of multiple small states meant that leaders constantly sought new alliances and strategies. Out of this environment emerged the kind of ambitious, charismatic figures who could imagine a larger, more unified kingdom. The decline of Chenla did not end political development. Instead, it laid the groundwork for transformation. Chenla also contributed to the shaping of Khmer identity. Although the kingdom was not as unified or enduring as later states, it created a political vocabulary that future leaders would use. Royal titles, religious rituals, and temple architecture from Chenla continued to influence the cultural landscape long after the kingdom lost its cohesion. These elements formed the essential building blocks for the new form of kingship that would arise in the 9th century. The decline of Chenla was gradual and complex, not sudden or catastrophic. Internal fragmentation, shifting trade routes, and regional competition all played a role. Yet even as Chenla weakened politically, its cultural influence expanded. More temples were built during this fragmented period than during the unified period that preceded it. Communities across the region used religion, art, and ritual to express their identities, strengthening the cultural foundations that would support future state building. The emergence of Jayavarman II marks one of the most decisive moments in Cambodian history. It is the turning point from a landscape filled with small, competing principalities to the rise of a unified kingdom that would later become the Khmer Empire. This transformation did not happen suddenly. It involved decades of movement, alliances, rituals, and political maneuvering. But at the center of it all stands a ruler whose vision shaped an entire civilization. By the time Jayavarman II appeared, Chenla had fractured into numerous regional powers. Local princes, clan leaders, and hereditary elites governed separate territories, each with its own networks of temples, villages, and agricultural lands. While these regions shared cultural and religious traditions, they lacked a strong central authority. This environment created opportunities for ambitious leaders to gather support and gradually expand their influence. Jayavarman II emerged from this world as a unifying figure who understood both the political landscape and the spiritual foundations needed to command loyalty. Historical sources about Jayavarman II come primarily from later inscriptions, especially those composed during the Angkorian period. While these texts were written long after his lifetime, they preserve essential details about how his reign was remembered and how he laid the ideological foundations of Angkor. They portray a leader who traveled across the region, consolidating fragmented territories and establishing new centers of power. These movements were not random. They reflect strategic decisions aimed at gathering the support of influential communities, controlling key agricultural zones, and linking different regions into one political system. One of the most significant aspects of Jayavarman II's journey was his relationship with regional elites. He did not simply conquer territory, he forged alliances. Inscriptions suggest that he gained recognition from local chiefs, possibly through a combination of diplomacy, marriage alliances, and demonstrations of military strength. Each territory he entered strengthened his position and expanded his circle of loyal supporters. This gradual consolidation laid the foundation for a new political identity that transcended the earlier divisions of Chenla. Jayavarman II's most famous symbolic act occurred on Phnom Kulen, a sacred mountain northeast of the Tonle Sap Lake. It was here that a ritual known as the Devaraja ceremony was performed. According to the inscriptions, a Brahmin priest named Hiranyadama conducted the ritual, which proclaimed Jayavarman II as the universal monarch, or Chakravartin. This was not simply a coronation. It was a declaration of independence from foreign influence and a statement that the ruler held divine authority over the land. The concept of the Devaraja, or God-King, played a crucial role in the political structure of the Angkorian state. It fused religious belief with political power, creating a relationship between the king, the gods, and the land. Through this ritual, the king was understood to be the earthly representative of Shiva, the supreme deity of the Hindu pantheon. This sacred status legitimized the king's absolute authority, allowing him to mobilize labor, command loyalty, and undertake grand public works. The choice of Phnom Kulen for this ceremony was significant. The mountain was associated with spiritual strength and natural purity. Performing the ritual there connected the new kingdom to the sacred geography of the region. It also signaled a shift of political focus toward the Angkor area, which would soon become the heart of one of the most powerful empires in Southeast Asian history. Following the ceremony, Jayavarman II established his capital at Hariharalaya, near the modern site of Rolos. This settlement marked the beginning of sustained development in the Angkor region. Hariharalaya became a center for administration, religious activity, and economic coordination. Its location near the floodplains provided fertile land for rice cultivation, while its proximity to rivers allowed for transportation and communication across the region. One of Jayavarman II's major contributions was laying the institutional framework for future kings. He established the idea that the ruler was not just a political leader, but also a sacred figure responsible for maintaining cosmic harmony. This belief created a system in which temples, priests, and royal rituals were essential parts of governance. It also encouraged future kings to build monumental structures that symbolized their divine role and reinforced their authority. Under Jayavarman II, the foundations of Angkor's hydraulic system began to take shape. While the vast reservoirs and canals built in later centuries were not yet constructed, the early stages of water management can be traced back to his reign. Controlling water was essential for rice production, which in turn supported the growing population and the state's economic strength. Establishing the capital near reliable water sources signaled a long-term strategy that would eventually turn Angkor into a highly organized agricultural powerhouse. The political consolidation achieved by Jayavarman II also opened opportunities for cultural development. With greater stability came increased patronage for religious institutions, artisans, and scholars. Priests played a central role in interpreting royal authority, while architects and builders began experimenting with structures that blended indigenous and Indian-inspired elements. These developments laid the groundwork for the sophisticated art and architecture that would flourish in the centuries that followed. Despite his accomplishments, Jayavarman II's reign was not without challenges. Unifying a fragmented region required constant negotiation and vigilance. Rival factions may have resisted his authority, and local customs had to be incorporated into the broader framework of the new kingdom. Yet, the endurance of his legacy suggests that he succeeded in creating a sense of unity powerful enough to outlast his lifetime. One of the reasons Jayavarman II is remembered as the founder of the Angkorian Empire is that he established a model for kingship that future rulers would emulate and expand. His successors inherited not just territory, but an ideology of rule that portrayed the king as the embodiment of divine order. This ideology justified large-scale building projects, the mobilization of labor, and the creation of massive temple complexes that celebrated both the gods and the king's divine status. The significance of the Devaraja ritual cannot be overstated. It provided a spiritual foundation that unified the kingdom across different regions and social groups. Farmers, artisans, monks, and nobles all participated in a political system that viewed the king as essential for maintaining balance between the earthly and the divine. This concept linked religion and governance in a way that shaped the character of Angkor for centuries. With the establishment of Hariharalaya and the rise of a unified kingship under Jayavarman II, Cambodia entered a transformative new era. The early Angkorian period witnessed the first large-scale projects that would eventually define one of the greatest civilizations in Southeast Asian history. This was the time when kings and their court officials developed the core elements of Angkor's long-term power: intensive rice agriculture, monumental temple construction, and a complex system of administration. These innovations did not emerge all at once, but grew steadily through the efforts of several early rulers, each contributing new ideas and architectural experiments that shaped the future of the empire. After Jayavarman II's death, his successors inherited not only a newly unified kingdom, but also the responsibility of maintaining and expanding it. One of the most important of these early rulers was Indravarman I. He established himself at Hariharalaya, continuing the development of the region and confirming it as the first stable political center of Angkor. His reign marked the beginning of an ambitious era of construction, during which kings used monumental architecture to demonstrate their authority, honor their ancestors, and reinforce the ideology of sacred kingship. Indravarman I's most significant contribution was the construction of a massive reservoir known as the Indratataka Barai. This enormous artificial lake represented a major leap forward in hydraulic engineering. Its creation required the mobilization of thousands of workers who dug earth, shaped embankments, and carved canals by hand. The Barai was designed not only to capture monsoon rains, but also to regulate water for rice fields throughout the year. By stabilizing the water supply, it allowed farmers to produce larger and more reliable harvests, supporting population growth and increasing the state's economic strength. The construction of the Indratataka Barai was a bold statement. It demonstrated that Angkorian rulers had the ability to alter the landscape itself. Water, which had always been essential for agriculture in the region, now became a symbol of royal authority. By controlling water, kings showed that they could maintain harmony between the natural world and the needs of their people. This association between kingship and water management would remain fundamental throughout Angkor's history. Alongside the Barai, Indravarman I also commissioned important temples. One of these was Prehistoric, a temple dedicated to his ancestors. Its name means sacred bull, referring to the revered animal associated with Shiva. The temple's towers were adorned with intricate carvings, and the entire structure reflected a fine blend of religious symbolism and artistic craftsmanship. Prehistoric set a precedent. Angkorian kings honored their predecessors through temples, reinforcing the idea that political authority was tied to ancestral legitimacy. By venerating ancestors in stone, rulers connected themselves to both the past and the divine realm. Indravarman I also built Bakong, a temple mountain structured as a stepped pyramid symbolizing Mount Meru, the sacred cosmic mountain in Hindu belief. This architectural form would become a defining feature of Angkorian religious architecture. Bakong's grandeur showed how rulers were beginning to use temples not only as places of worship but also as political statements. They served as visual reminders of the king's sacred status and his central place in maintaining cosmic order. After Indravarman I, kings continued expanding the empire's physical and symbolic foundations. His successor, Yasovarman I, moved the capital from Hariharalaya to a new location at Phnom Bakheng, situated on a hill overlooking the surrounding plains. He named this new city Yasodarapura, marking a significant step toward the development of the Angkor complex as it is known today. The choice of a hilltop location for the central temple was deeply symbolic. Phnom Bakheng became the spiritual center of the kingdom, representing the axis of the universe. Its temple was constructed in the form of a mountain symbolizing Mount Meru, with multiple terraces representing the divine layers of the cosmos. Surrounding it were reservoirs, canals, and a growing network of settlements. Yasovarman I understood that a capital was not only an administrative center, but also a physical embodiment of spiritual belief. One of Jayavarman I's most enduring achievements was the construction of the East Barai, a massive reservoir even larger than the one built by his predecessor. The creation of such a grand reservoir demonstrated the increasing sophistication of Angkor's hydraulic system. The East Barai stretched across a vast area and required extraordinary planning. Its construction helped distribute water to surrounding rice fields, supporting a growing population and reinforcing the central authority of the king who commanded such immense public works. These early hydraulic projects formed the backbone of Angkor's agricultural success. In a region where monsoon rains can be unpredictable, the ability to control water gave Angkorian rulers extraordinary power. They could ensure stable food production, feed laborers, and support armies. As the hydraulic network expanded, so did the capacity of the state to organize resources and people. This rise in productivity allowed the kingdom to invest even more in temples, roads, and public infrastructure. Over time, these investments generated a stable and prosperous society that became the envy of the region. As the capital grew, so did Angkorian society itself. Villages clustered around canals and reservoirs, forming interconnected networks of communities that provided labor, agricultural goods, and religious offerings. Priests and scholars served the temples, maintaining rituals and advising the court on matters of religion and governance. Artisans crafted stone, wood, and metal, producing sculptures, inscriptions, and decorative elements that adorned temples and palaces. Each group contributed to the functioning of a society organized around the twin pillars of agriculture and religion. The early Angkorian period also saw the emergence of inscriptions carved into stone, which provide valuable insights into the society's organization. These inscriptions recorded the names of kings, descriptions of temple dedications, and details of land grants. They show that the Angkorian state managed large networks of temple lands worked by villagers who were assigned to maintain the temples and support the priests. These records reveal a sophisticated system of administration, with officials responsible for managing resources, resolving disputes, and organizing labor. Within this evolving system, the role of the king continued to grow. Rulers needed to be both political leaders and religious figures. They presided over ceremonies, dedicated temples, and ensured that the gods were properly honored. Their legitimacy depended on their ability to balance these responsibilities. A successful king was one who expanded the state, maintained harmony with the divine, and ensured prosperity for the people. This expectation encouraged rulers to undertake new building projects during every reign. Each king sought to leave his mark through temples, reservoirs, and city planning. These structures were not only religious monuments, but also demonstrations of political power. They anchored the king's authority in the landscape and reminded the population of his role as a sacred intermediary. As Angkor's population increased, the workforce required for temple construction and water management also grew. Laborers came from local villages and were organized into teams responsible for different tasks. Carvers, masons, engineers, and transport workers collaborated to build structures that required remarkable precision. Stone blocks were transported from distant quarries and fitted together without mortar. Carvings covered walls, doorways, and columns with intricate details representing mythological scenes, divine figures, and symbolic motifs. The early Angkorian era also witnessed the rise of artistic styles that would later reach their peak in the great temples of later centuries. Sculptures became more refined, carvings more elaborate, and architectural layouts more sophisticated. These artistic developments reflected both continuity with earlier styles and new innovations inspired by growing religious complexity. The ascent of Jayavarman II marks one of the most remarkable chapters in Cambodian history. His reign represents the moment when Angkor reached a height of artistic, political, and territorial achievement unmatched in earlier centuries. While the foundations of the empire had been carefully laid by generations of earlier rulers, it was under Jayavarman II that these elements came together to create a unified, confident, and expansive kingdom. His legacy is most visible in the monumental temple of Angkor Wat, but the story of his reign goes far beyond a single building. It encompasses military ambition, diplomatic outreach, administrative consolidation, and the continued refinement of the ideological system that defined the Khmer Empire. Before Jayavarman II rose to power, the kingdom experienced internal struggles over succession. The throne did not always pass smoothly from one ruler to the next. Competing branches of the royal family, regional elites, and powerful officials sometimes used these moments of uncertainty to advance their own interests. Jayavarman II appears to have been an outsider to the existing line of succession, and his accession likely involved significant conflict. Inscriptions suggest that he fought his way to the throne, defeating rival claimants and securing the loyalty of key officials. This initial struggle shaped his rule, making stability and consolidation essential priorities from the beginning. Once in power, Jayavarman II moved quickly to strengthen central authority. He built alliances with influential families, appointed loyal officials to govern key provinces, and reaffirmed the sacred status of the monarchy. His reign is often associated with order and discipline, qualities that helped stabilize the kingdom after a period of uncertainty. By ensuring the cooperation of regional elites, he laid the groundwork for major projects that required vast amounts of labor and resources. One of the defining features of Jayavarman II's reign was his military activity. Unlike earlier kings, whose focus remained primarily on internal development and religious construction, Jayavarman II pursued an ambitious program of territorial expansion. Inscriptions and regional records indicate that he launched campaigns into neighboring areas, extending Khmer influence across parts of mainland Southeast Asia. His armies fought against rival states, particularly in regions that are now part of Thailand and Vietnam. These campaigns were not merely acts of aggression. They were aimed at securing trade routes, protecting borders, and asserting the dominance of the Khmer Empire in a competitive political landscape. Jayavarman II's military successes enhanced his reputation and reinforced the ideology of sacred kingship. Victorious rulers were seen as favored by the gods, and their achievements were interpreted as signs of cosmic approval. This connection between divine authority and earthly victory strengthened the king's legitimacy and allowed him to mobilize the empire's resources with greater confidence. Diplomatically, Jayavarman II was equally active. He maintained contact with the powerful kingdom of Champa, sometimes through conflict and other times through negotiation. He also fostered relations with distant China, sending diplomatic missions that brought prestige and recognition. These exchanges served both symbolic and practical purposes. They allowed Angkor to present itself as a sophisticated and influential state, while also facilitating trade and the exchange of valuable goods. But the greatest legacy of Jayavarman II is undoubtedly Angkor Wat, a masterpiece of architecture, engineering, and artistic expression. Unlike earlier temples that were dedicated primarily to Shiva, Angkor Wat was devoted to Vishnu. This shift may reflect the king's personal religious devotion or a broader political strategy aimed at distinguishing his reign from those of his predecessors. Whatever the motivation, the result was a temple complex of extraordinary scale and significance. Angkor Wat was designed as a temple mountain, a symbolic representation of Mount Meru, the center of the universe in Hindu cosmology. Its layout follows a precise and sophisticated plan, with concentric galleries, long causeways, and towering central spires. The outer enclosure alone covers an immense area, surrounded by a moat that required vast amounts of labor to excavate. The causeway leading to the temple's entrance stretches across the water, creating a dramatic and deliberate sense of transition from the ordinary world to the divine realm. The central towers rise in a series of levels, culminating in the highest sanctuary that represents the dwelling place of the gods. Each tower was carefully constructed using sandstone blocks transported from quarries located far from the capital. The method of construction demonstrates an extraordinary level of organization and technical skill. Builders shaped the stone with precision, fitting each block into place without mortar. The scale of the project required not only skilled artisans, but also enormous numbers of laborers who hauled stone, dug waterways, and cleared forests. One of the most striking features of Angkor Wat is its extensive bas-relief carvings. These carvings depict scenes from Hindu epics such as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, as well as historical and mythological narratives associated with kingship. They stretch across long corridors, illustrating battles, divine beings, celestial dances, and scenes of cosmic creation. These images served both religious and political purposes. They celebrated the gods while also symbolically aligning Jayavarman II with heroic figures and divine authority. The imagery at Angkor Wat also includes depictions believed to represent the king himself. These portray him in ceremonial contexts, reinforcing his connection to the divine and his role as a protector of the realm. Such artistic representations were not merely decorative. They were woven into the ideological framework of the empire, helping subjects understand the cosmic role of their ruler. Angkor Wat's orientation adds another layer of significance. Most Angkorian temples dedicated to Shiva face east, aligning with the rising sun. Angkor Wat, however, faces west. Scholars have offered different interpretations of this design. Some believe it reflects the temple's dedication to Vishnu, who is often associated with the west. Others propose that Angkor Wat served a dual purpose as a state temple during the king's lifetime and as a funerary monument after his death. While the exact meaning remains debated, the westward orientation highlights the temple's unique place in the Angkorian world. Beyond its religious and political functions, Angkor Wat played a key role in demonstrating the administrative capacity of the Khmer Empire. The sheer scale of the project required well-organized labor, supply networks, and skilled supervision. Artisans needed food, tools, and materials, all of which had to be transported, stored, and distributed efficiently. Such coordination reflects the strength of the state and its ability to mobilize resources across a vast territory. The temple complex also reveals much about daily life in Angkor. The presence of living quarters, water features, and shrines suggests that Angkor Wat was not isolated, but integrated into the broader landscape of the capital. Pilgrims, priests, workers, and officials all passed through its corridors, participating in rituals that link the physical world with spiritual truths. The rhythms of life around Angkor Wat reflected the fusion of religion, governance, and community that defined the Khmer Empire. Jayavarman II's reign extended beyond temple building and military expansion. He also played a role in shaping the empire's legal and administrative systems. Inscriptions from his era mention regulations regarding temple lands, taxation, and the responsibilities of officials. These records suggest that he sought to strengthen the institutional framework established by earlier rulers, ensuring that the state functioned smoothly and that religious institutions received proper support. The reign of Jayavarman VII stands as one of the most dramatic and transformative periods in Cambodian history. His time on the throne reshaped the religious identity of the Khmer Empire, reconstructed the capital after a devastating invasion, and reimagined kingship in ways that echoed for centuries. If earlier rulers defined Angkor through temples dedicated to Hindu gods and massive hydraulic works that strengthened political authority, Jayavarman VII added a new dimension, the ideal of a compassionate Buddhist king whose duty was not only to rule, but to heal a wounded nation. To understand his rise, we must first recognize the crisis that preceded him. After the grandeur of Jayavarman II and the creation of Angkor Wat, the empire faced internal instability and external threats. One of the most serious dangers came from the Kingdom of Champa, located along the central and southern coasts of what is now Vietnam. Relations between Angkor and Champa had long been marked by rivalry, shifting alliances, and occasional conflict. But during the late 12th century of the Common Era, the Cham forces launched a bold and destructive attack that changed everything. In a sudden and shocking campaign, Cham warriors sailed up the Mekong and Tonle Sap waterways and stormed the Khmer capital. Their invasion was swift, violent, and deeply traumatic. They entered Angkor, caused widespread destruction, and disrupted the symbolic and political heart of the empire. Temples burned, people fled, and the steady rhythm of Angkorian life was shattered. The invasion exposed weaknesses in the empire's military defenses and leadership, leaving the population disoriented and in need of a strong, unifying ruler. It was during this moment of crisis that Jayavarman VII emerged. Unlike some earlier kings who came to power through straightforward succession, his path to the throne involved years of conflict, strategic alliances, and personal resilience. He had spent time away from the capital, likely gathering support among regional leaders and preparing to reclaim the kingdom from chaos. The Cham invasion provided both the justification and the opportunity for him to assert his leadership. Jayavarman VII led the Khmer counteroffensive against the Cham forces. Through determined military action, he ultimately drove them out of Angkor and reclaimed the capital. His victory restored not only political control, but also the confidence of the Khmer people. In the wake of such devastation, the population needed a ruler who could repair both the physical and spiritual wounds of the kingdom. Jayavarman VII stepped into that role with a vision unlike that of any previous monarch. One of the most extraordinary aspects of his reign was his embrace of Mahayana Buddhism as the foundation of state ideology. While earlier kings had patronized Hinduism and occasionally supported Buddhist communities, Jayavarman VII made Buddhism the central religious force of the empire. This shift was not simply a personal choice. It reflected a profound transformation in how kingship was understood. Mahayana Buddhism emphasizes compassion, mercy, and the ideal of the bodhisattva, an enlightened being who delays final liberation in order to help others. Jayavarman VII presented himself as such a figure, a ruler who devoted his life to easing the suffering of his people. Inscriptions from his reign include moving statements in which he expresses deep concern for his subjects. In one famous passage, he declared that he could not rest while his people suffered, and that their physical and spiritual well-being was his greatest responsibility. This new vision of kingship found physical expression in the reconstruction of Angkor. Jayavarman VII launched the most ambitious building program in Khmer history, far surpassing the temples and public works of earlier eras. His projects were not merely monumental displays of power, they also served practical and moral purposes aligned with Buddhist ideals. The centerpiece of his reconstruction was the establishment of Angkor Thom, a new capital city built on the ruins of the old one. At its heart stood the Bayon, a temple unlike any other in the empire. The Bayon's most distinctive feature is the multitude of massive stone faces carved into its towers. These serene, smiling faces, often interpreted as representing the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, project an image of compassion, wisdom, and protective benevolence. They also symbolically embodied the king himself, whose gaze was believed to watch over the entire realm. Each face radiates calm strength, suggesting a ruler who offered guidance through troubled times. The Bayon's bas-reliefs provide vivid insights into life during Jayavarman VII's reign. They depict scenes of markets, festivals, hunting parties, naval battles, and daily activities. Unlike earlier temple carvings focused strictly on mythological themes, these images include ordinary people, reflecting the Buddhist emphasis on the lives and experiences of all beings. Yet, they still affirm the power and legitimacy of the king, showing him leading armies, receiving tributes, and maintaining order. Another monumental project from his reign was Ta Prohm, a temple dedicated to his mother. It was designed as a monastic complex filled with shrines, galleries, and halls meant to serve a large community of monks, scholars, and worshippers. Unlike some temples that were meticulously cleared of vegetation, Ta Prohm was intentionally left partially enveloped by the forest, reminding visitors of the sacred connection between nature and spirituality. Its inscriptions reveal detailed accounts of the workers, artisans, and support staff assigned to the temple, demonstrating the scale of human organization behind Jayavarman VII's projects. Similarly, he built Preah Khan, a temple dedicated to his father. Like Ta Prohm, Preah Khan was both a religious center and an administrative hub. It functioned as a kind of mini-city supporting priests, teachers, and lay people. These paired dedications to his parents reflect Jayavarman VII's commitment to honoring his lineage while also reinforcing the moral dimension of his rule. But Jayavarman VII's Buddhist influence extended far beyond temple construction. He initiated an extraordinary program of public welfare unmatched in Angkorian history. Inscriptions record that he built rest houses along the empire's major highways, providing shelter for travelers and pilgrims. These structures, known as dharamshalas, were spaced at regular intervals along the vast road network connecting distant provinces. They demonstrated the king's desire to care for his people and to encourage movement, trade, and communication across the empire. He also established hospitals throughout the kingdom, staffed with medical personnel and stocked with herbal remedies. These facilities, known as aramas, were dedicated to healing the sick and easing suffering. Their creation reflected the Buddhist principle of compassion, as well as the practical needs of a population recovering from war and hardship. The presence of hospitals in such an early period testifies to the sophistication of the Khmer administrative system and the ethical priorities of its leaders. Jayavarman VII's reign was not without challenges. His ambitious building projects placed heavy demands on labor and resources. The vast scale of his public works required enormous amounts of stone, timber, and manpower. While many of his subjects likely viewed him as a benevolent ruler, others may have struggled under the weight of the obligations imposed by large-scale construction efforts. Yet the overall legacy of his rule suggests that his vision inspired widespread loyalty and admiration. The king also had to navigate political tensions with neighboring states. Although he successfully expelled the Cham invaders, relations with Champa remained complex throughout his reign. He carried out further military campaigns to secure border regions and prevent future attacks. These actions balanced his Buddhist ideals with the practical realities of defending an empire. The period following the reign of Jayavarman VII marks the beginning of a slow but profound transformation in the fortunes of Angkor. For centuries, the empire had grown through its mastery of water, the power of its kings, and the stability of its agricultural and religious foundations. Yet the very systems that once sustained Angkor eventually became sources of vulnerability. The decline of Angkor was not caused by a single catastrophe, but by a combination of environmental stress, military pressures, religious changes, and shifting economic networks. Together, these factors gradually weakened the foundations of the empire, leading to a slow unraveling rather than a dramatic fall. One of the earliest signs of strain appeared in the empire's hydraulic system. For generations, Angkor's strength had depended on its ability to capture and manage water through reservoirs, canals, and irrigation channels. These systems allowed farmers to cultivate rice throughout the year and supported a large population. But such engineering required constant maintenance. Sediment accumulated in canals, embankments eroded, and natural shifts in water flow demanded frequent adjustments. Under the ambitious building campaigns of Jayavarman VII, the empire expanded its waterworks to unprecedented levels. However, this expansion also stretched the capacity of the administrative system to maintain them. Environmental studies of the region suggest that during the late 13th and early 14th centuries of the Common Era, the area experienced a series of unpredictable climate fluctuations. Evidence from tree ring analysis and sediment cores points to cycles of severe drought followed by intense monsoon rains. These extreme patterns would have placed enormous pressure on Angkor's hydraulic network. During drought years, reservoirs would dry up, reducing rice yields and weakening the ability of the state to support its population. During periods of heavy rainfall, the same reservoirs and canals could overflow or suffer structural damage. Without regular and coordinated maintenance, the system began to deteriorate. The weakening of the hydraulic system had far-reaching consequences. Rice production, the lifeblood of the empire, became less reliable. Food shortages may have sparked unrest or weakened loyalty to the central government. Reduced agricultural output also undermined temple economies, which relied on rice and other goods to support priests, workers, and rituals. In a kingdom where religion and politics were deeply intertwined, any disruption in temple operations could erode the ideological foundation of kingship. Meanwhile, external political pressures were increasing. The Kingdom of Siam, based in the city of Ayutthaya, was rising as a powerful regional force to the west. Relations between Angkor and Ayutthaya shifted between periods of uneasy peace and open conflict. As Siam grew stronger, it sought to expand its influence over neighboring regions, including territories once under Khmer control. At the same time, the Kingdom of Lan Xang to the north and various Vietnamese states to the east added to the complexity of regional politics. Siamese incursions into Angkorian territory became increasingly frequent during the 14th and 15th centuries. These attacks were not merely raids, they challenged the political heart of the empire. Angkor, once the dominant force in mainland Southeast Asia, now found itself defending against a younger, more dynamic kingdom whose military strategies and political organization presented a formidable challenge. Some Siamese forces succeeded in penetrating deep into Khmer territory, occasionally threatening or temporarily capturing the capital. The pressures from war were compounded by internal political fragmentation. After the death of Jayavarman II, the empire did not maintain a strong and stable line of succession. Several rulers came to the throne during periods of turmoil, and not all possessed the charisma or authority needed to unify a struggling state. Factionalism grew, particularly among regional elites who were less willing to contribute resources to the central government at a time of declining prosperity. Another major factor contributing to Angkor's gradual decline was a religious transformation that reshaped the cultural foundations of the empire. During and after the reign of Jayavarman VII, Mahayana Buddhism flourished across the region. However, in the following centuries, Theravada Buddhism began to spread widely throughout mainland Southeast Asia, including Cambodia. Theravada Buddhism, which emphasizes personal spiritual development and monastic simplicity, did not require the same level of temple-centered grandeur as earlier Hindu and Mahayana traditions. As this new form of Buddhism took root, the elaborate temple economies that had supported grand building projects and large priestly communities began to lose their central importance. The adoption of Theravada Buddhism also influenced political ideology. The concept of the king as a divine figure, central to the Hindu and Mahayana traditions of earlier centuries, was softened under Theravada influence. Kings remained important, but their sacred status became less pronounced. As a result, rulers may have found it more difficult to command the kind of labor and resources needed to maintain the vast temple networks and hydraulic systems. Over time, this weakened the state's ability to sustain the monumental structures that symbolized its power. At the same time, economic changes beyond Angkor's borders altered regional trade patterns. During the height of Funan and Angkor, Cambodia had been a major participant in long-distance trade between India and China. But by the late medieval period, coastal trade routes were becoming more important than inland river systems. Powerful port cities began to rise along the coastlines of Southeast Asia, attracting merchants and wealth that might once have flowed through Cambodian territory. As trade shifted toward the coast, Angkor's inland location became a disadvantage. Economic activity increasingly bypassed the city, weakening its role as a commercial and political center. The combined weight of environmental decline, military pressure, shifting trade, political fragmentation, and religious transformation gradually eroded Angkor's capacity to function as the heart of a large empire. By the 14th century of the Common Era, it was no longer the unrivaled center of power it had once been. The city suffered repeated setbacks, including a particularly damaging Siamese attack that contributed to the decision to gradually relocate the political center southward. The centuries that followed the decline of Angkor marked a new and challenging era for Cambodia. With the great hydraulic cities no longer functioning as the political center of the kingdom, the capital gradually shifted southward toward the region of Phnom Penh and its surrounding river systems. This shift was not simply a change in geography, it reflected a fundamental transformation in the kingdom's political, economic, and diplomatic realities. Cambodia was entering a world in which its survival depended on navigating the ambitions of stronger neighbors, Siam to the west and Vietnam to the east. The early modern period became a long struggle to maintain autonomy in a region shaped by rising powers, shifting alliances, and new global forces. After Angkor's political authority faded, the Khmer kingdom reorganized itself around smaller centers such as Long Vec and later Udong. These locations were better suited for a kingdom that relied increasingly on river-based trade and needed strong defenses against invasions from both land and water. Although these new capitals lacked the monumental grandeur of Angkor, they were strategically placed along major waterways that connected Cambodia to the bustling maritime world of the early modern era. Long Vec emerged as one of the first major capitals of this period. Situated along the Tonle Sap River, it became the center of Cambodian political life after Angkor's decline. Long Vec was not a monumental stone city, but a fortified settlement built with practicality in mind. Its location allowed Cambodian rulers to connect with traders from across Asia, including merchants from China, Japan, and the Malay world. These interactions brought new technologies, weapons, and ideas into Cambodia, helping the kingdom adapt to the rapidly changing regional environment. However, Cambodia's geographic position also made it vulnerable. To the west, Siam, centered in Ayutthaya, was expanding aggressively. Siam had already challenged Angkor in earlier centuries and continued to see the Khmer kingdom as both a rival and a strategic buffer zone. To the east, Vietnam, under the rule of powerful dynasties and later the Nguyen lords, was extending its influence southward. Vietnam's growth brought its armies, settlers, and administrators ever closer to Cambodian lands. Caught between these two assertive neighbors, Cambodia struggled to maintain its sovereignty. One of the defining features of this era was the constant diplomatic balancing act required for survival. Cambodian kings often found themselves forced to pay tribute to either Siam or Vietnam, or sometimes both, depending on which power appeared strongest at a given moment. Tribute did not necessarily mean total submission. It was sometimes a strategic gesture meant to buy peace, avoid invasion, or secure trade privileges. Yet these tribute relationships placed enormous pressure on the kingdom. When one neighbor gained influence at Cambodia's court, the other often responded with threats or military intervention. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries of the Common Era, Siamese influence frequently dominated Cambodian affairs. Siamese armies invaded Cambodian territory more than once, capturing capitals, installing client rulers, and demanding tribute. One of the most devastating events occurred when a Siamese invasion forced the abandonment of Long Vec. This loss represented not only a military defeat, but also a symbolic blow to Cambodian pride. Long Vec had become associated with learning, trade, and relatively strong leadership, and its fall marked a deep wound in the national memory. After the fall of Long Vec, the capital moved to Udong, located farther south. This site remained an important center of Cambodian governance for generations, and it reflected the kingdom's determination to rebuild after repeated invasions. Udong served as both a defensive stronghold and a cultural center. Although the kingdom's power was diminished, Cambodian rulers continued to maintain religious institutions, promote artistic traditions, and seek diplomatic solutions to protect their independence. During this period, Cambodia's internal politics were deeply influenced by the constant struggle between Siamese and Vietnamese interests. Some Cambodian rulers leaned toward Siam for support, hoping to counterbalance Vietnamese pressure. Others sought Vietnamese backing to limit Siamese influence. These shifting alliances sometimes resulted in rival claimants to the throne, each supported by a different foreign power. Internal divisions weakened the kingdom further, making it easier for neighbors to interfere. Vietnamese influence increased significantly as the Nguyen lords expanded their control southward through a process known as marching to the south. Vietnamese settlers, administrators, and military forces began to move into areas near the Cambodian border, especially the fertile Mekong Delta. Over time, these regions, once inhabited by Khmer communities, came under increasing Vietnamese control. This gradual encroachment strained relations between the two kingdoms and reshaped the ethnic and political landscape of the region. Despite these pressures, Cambodia continued to demonstrate resilience. One figure who played a crucial role in navigating this difficult era was King Ang Chan. His reign is remembered for efforts to strengthen the kingdom internally and reduce external tensions. He resisted Siamese influence at key moments and sought to stabilize relations with Vietnam. His diplomatic skills helped maintain a fragile balance that allowed Cambodia to survive despite its weakened state. Another important ruler was King Ang Duong, whose leadership in the 19th century of the Common Era marked a turning point in Cambodian efforts to protect sovereignty. Ang Duong recognized that Cambodia could no longer rely on shifting alliances between Siam and Vietnam. He believed that only an external power, unconnected to regional rivalries, could serve as a lasting protector. In this context, he turned his attention to France, which had begun expanding its presence in Southeast Asia. Although Ang Duong passed away before seeing the full results of his diplomatic outreach, his efforts laid the foundations for the emergence of Cambodia as a French protectorate. Throughout the early modern period, Cambodian society continued to evolve in response to new influences. Theravada Buddhism, which had spread widely by the decline of Angkor, became deeply rooted in everyday life. Monasteries played a central role in education, moral guidance, and community identity. Even in times of war and political turmoil, Buddhist institutions helped preserve cultural continuity. Monks served as teachers, record keepers, and spiritual counselors, reinforcing a sense of unity that transcended political instability. Trade also remained a vital part of Cambodian life. While inland trade routes had diminished in importance with the decline of Angkor, coastal and river-based commerce grew more significant. Goods such as rice, timber, spices, and forest products moved through Cambodian ports, linking the kingdom to regional markets. Foreign merchants brought firearms and new technologies, which played increasingly important roles in warfare and political power. These interactions helped Cambodia remain connected to broader economic networks despite its weakened political position. Cultural resilience can also be seen in the arts. Cambodian dance, music, and literature continued to flourish during this period, often supported by royal patronage. Artistic traditions adapted to new influences, incorporating regional styles while maintaining core Khmer elements. Even under external pressure, the kingdom preserved its cultural identity, demonstrating that Cambodian civilization was far more enduring than any single political era. As the 19th century of the Common Era unfolded, Cambodia found itself squeezed ever more tightly between two powerful regional neighbors, Siam to the west and Vietnam to the east. Both kingdoms had interfered repeatedly in Cambodian affairs, installing rival claimants to the throne, absorbing territories, and drawing Cambodia into their political orbit. By this time, the Khmer kingdom had neither the military strength nor the political unity to resist these pressures on its own. It was in this environment of vulnerability and uncertainty that Cambodia entered the age of European imperialism, a global shift that would profoundly alter the future of the region. The arrival of the French in Southeast Asia was part of a much larger expansion of European power during the 19th century. France had already established a foothold in southern Vietnam, known then as Cochinchina, and was seeking to extend its influence further. Missionaries, traders, and diplomats had been active in the region for years, but by the mid-19th century, French interests became more strategic. They saw the Mekong River as a potential route into the interior of Asia and viewed Cambodia as a key piece of this geopolitical puzzle. At the same time, Cambodia's rulers were increasingly desperate for a way to preserve their kingdom's independence. King Ang Duong, one of the most capable leaders of the era, understood that Cambodia's traditional strategy of balancing Siam and Vietnam was no longer effective. Both neighbors were too strong, and Cambodian internal divisions made it even more difficult to resist their influence. Ang Duong began to explore the possibility of forming an alliance with a distant Western power, one that had no historical claims over Cambodian territory and could therefore serve as a more neutral protector. Although King Ong Duong died before his plans reached fruition, his successor, King Norodom, inherited both the throne and the complex situation facing the kingdom. Norodom had been aligned with Siam during the succession conflict, but soon recognized that Siamese control over Cambodia was deepening. His position was weak, and internal rivals continued to challenge his authority. In this context, the French presented themselves as a solution to Cambodia's political crisis. French officials encouraged King Norodom to accept their protection, promising to guarantee Cambodian independence from Siam and Vietnam. For Norodom, the decision was not easy. Accepting French protection meant relinquishing aspects of royal authority, while refusing could result in further domination by Siam or Vietnam. After negotiations and considerable pressure from the French, Norodom eventually agreed. In the early 1860s of the Common Era, Cambodia officially became a French protectorate. The establishment of the Protectorate marked a major turning point. Under French rule, Cambodia retained its monarchy, but real power shifted to colonial administrators. The French reshaped the kingdom's political structure, economy, and external relations. They justified their rule by claiming to bring modernization and stability, but their methods often placed Cambodian sovereignty in a subordinate position. One of France's first actions was to formalize Cambodia's borders, something previous regional powers had not done clearly. Siam returned some territories to Cambodia under French pressure, although others remained under Siamese control. The French also negotiated with Vietnam, incorporating Cambodia into a larger colonial entity known as French Indochina. In this new structure, Cambodia was grouped together with Vietnam and Laos under a single administrative framework. Decisions about trade, taxation, and foreign relations were increasingly dictated from Saigon or Hanoi rather than Phnom Penh. Internally, the French introduced a centralized bureaucracy modeled on European systems. They sought to standardize administration, legal processes, and taxation. While these reforms brought a degree of order, they also weakened traditional Khmer institutions. Local leaders who had once governed through custom and personal authority were now subject to French-appointed officials. The monarchy itself was preserved for symbolic value, but French residents general held decisive power. Economically, the French emphasized resource extraction and agricultural production. They introduced new crops, expanded rice cultivation for export, and often relied on Vietnamese migrant labor to work in Cambodian fields and plantations. This influx of laborers contributed to long-term demographic changes, especially in regions near the Mekong Delta, where Vietnamese communities grew significantly. For many Cambodian peasants, colonial economic policies meant heavier taxes, land pressure, and greater dependence on markets controlled by foreign merchants. Yet the French presence also brought certain developments that would have lasting cultural and historical importance. French scholars, especially those associated with the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, undertook extensive studies of Cambodian language, culture, and history. They were particularly fascinated by the ruins of Angkor, which had become overgrown and little understood by the wider world. French archaeologists began clearing vegetation, restoring temples, and documenting inscriptions. Their work eventually brought global attention to Angkor's extraordinary architectural legacy, transforming it into a symbol of Cambodian identity. At the same time, education systems began to change. Although French schooling was limited and primarily aimed at training local administrators, it introduced new subjects, including European languages and sciences. This small but growing educated class played an important role in shaping early Cambodian nationalism in the 20th century of the Common Era. Religious life also evolved. Theravada Buddhism remained central to Cambodian cultural identity, and French authorities generally avoided interfering with monastic communities, seeing them as stabilizing forces. However, the relationship between the Sangha, the Buddhist monastic order, and the colonial government was complex. Monks continued to serve as moral guides and educators, but they also became involved in early discussions about reform and national identity. which would later influence independence movements. Socially, the colonial period brought significant changes to everyday life. Urban centers such as Phnom Penh expanded, with new administrative buildings, markets, and transport networks. Roads, bridges, and railways were constructed to connect different parts of the colony, though many of these projects primarily served French economic interests. French cultural influence was visible in architecture, fashion, and public ceremonies, especially among the urban elite. Yet in rural areas, traditional Khmer customs remained dominant, and many communities continued to live much as they had for generations. One of the most persistent challenges during this period was the tension between Cambodian aspirations for autonomy and the realities of colonial rule. King Norodom struggled to assert his authority, often clashing with French officials who limited his power. His successor, King Sisowath, had a more cooperative relationship with the French, but the monarchy's limited autonomy remained unchanged. While the French justified their presence by claiming to protect Cambodia from Siam and Vietnam, they increasingly interfered in domestic affairs, sometimes provoking resistance. As the 19th century of the Common Era gave way to the 20th, the French Protectorate over Cambodia continued to reshape the kingdom in far-reaching ways. For decades, Cambodia had remained under firm colonial control, its political structures constrained, its economy oriented toward French interests, and its monarchy restricted to ceremonial authority. Yet beneath the surface, gradual transformations were taking place. A small but influential class of educated Cambodians was emerging. New ideas about identity and governance were spreading, and global events were weakening the European colonial order. These developments laid the groundwork for the nationalist movements that would eventually lead Cambodia toward independence. The early decades of the 20th century saw significant changes in Cambodian society. One of the most consequential was the growth of a modern educated elite. French colonial administrators had established schools intended to train clerks, translators, and minor officials who could assist in running the colony. Although such schools reached only a small portion of the population, they produced a generation of Cambodians who were exposed to new subjects, including European history, geography, law, and political theory. These young scholars, often from urban families or Buddhist monastic backgrounds, became increasingly aware of global movements for political reform. At the same time, Buddhist monks continued to play a key role in education and cultural continuity. Monasteries remained centers of literacy and learning, teaching Pali, Khmer literature, and moral philosophy. As monks interacted with laypeople, discussed social issues, and observed colonial policies, some began to question the legitimacy of foreign rule. Buddhist ethics, which emphasized moral leadership and compassion, were difficult to reconcile with the realities of colonial exploitation. This tension helped plant the early seeds of reformist thinking within the religious community. While internal developments were important, global events also played a decisive role in shaping Cambodian nationalism. The First World War had significant indirect effects on the colonies of Southeast Asia. France demanded labor and resources from Indochina to support the war effort, causing hardship for local populations. Meanwhile, the war undermined the perception of European invincibility. Colonized peoples observed that even the great powers of Europe were vulnerable to destruction and internal conflict. This realization chipped away at the ideological foundation supporting colonial rule. In the years that followed the First World War, new political ideas, such as democracy, socialism, and self-determination, spread across Asia. Reformist movements emerged in India, China, and Vietnam, inspiring intellectuals throughout the region. Newspapers, pamphlets, and letters circulated widely, reaching Cambodian students and monks. Though the colonial administration attempted to restrict political discussion, the ideas of national liberation were already beginning to take root. Economic pressures also contributed to the rise of nationalist sentiment. Cambodian peasants bore the burden of colonial taxation and were vulnerable to fluctuations in rice prices, land conflicts, and forced labor demands. When farmers struggled, villagers often blamed the colonial government, which controlled taxation and land laws. These grievances, though local in nature, fed into broader dissatisfaction with foreign rule. King Norodom's passing and the rise of King Sisowath, followed by King Sisowath Monivong, did little to restore Cambodia's autonomy. But the monarchy remained an important symbol of national identity. The kings, though constrained, represented continuity with the ancient past and the spiritual heart of the Khmer people. This symbolic value would later play a vital role in mobilizing nationalist sentiment. The interwar period saw increased political activity among educated Cambodians. One of the earliest organized movements was the Buddhist Institute, established with French support but soon becoming a center for the preservation and modernization of Khmer culture. Scholars at the institute translated Buddhist texts, promoted Khmer literature, and encouraged cultural pride. Although not overtly political, the institute helped strengthen a sense of national identity rooted in language, religion, and shared heritage. In the realm of print media, Cambodian journalists began publishing newspapers that discussed social issues, corruption, cultural revival, and occasionally criticisms of the colonial administration. These publications reached small but influential audiences, fostering the beginnings of public debate. The emergence of a literate public sphere marked a major step forward in the development of Cambodian nationalism. As global tensions rose again in the late 1930s, the political landscape of Southeast Asia was poised for transformation. The outbreak of the Second World War drastically altered the balance of power in the region. Japanese forces swept across Asia, defeating European colonial armies and challenging Western authority. In Indochina, Japan allowed the French colonial administration to remain nominally in place but exerted growing influence over political decisions. For Cambodians, the presence of Japan sent a powerful message. European colonial rule was not permanent. Although Japan's motives were far from altruistic, its successes demonstrated that Western empires could be displaced. In Cambodia, some nationalist thinkers began to see Japan as a potential ally in the struggle for independence, while others viewed the Japanese occupation as a new form of foreign domination. Regardless of public perception, the upheaval caused by the war opened opportunities for political change. King Sisowath Monivong passed away during this turbulent period, and the French supported the ascension of the young Prince Norodom Sihanouk to the throne. Sihanouk was formally crowned amid the uncertainties of a region at war. The French believed that Sihanouk, inexperienced and youthful, would be easy to influence. However, events soon proved that the war had fundamentally weakened the colonial system. In the final years of the Second World War, Japan encouraged nationalist movements across Asia to weaken European control. In Cambodia, Japanese authorities pressured the French administration, allowing increased political activism. Nationalist leaders emerged, forming new organizations and advocating for reforms. For a brief period near the end of the war, Cambodian activists declared autonomy under Japanese sponsorship, although this independence was short-lived. When Japan surrendered, French colonial officials attempted to reassert their authority, but the political environment had changed forever. Post-war France faced enormous challenges. Its economy was devastated, its political system weakened, and its colonies increasingly demanded independence. In Indochina, nationalist movements were stronger and more organized than ever before. Vietnam erupted into conflict between the Viet Minh and returning French forces, while Laos and Cambodia pressed for greater autonomy. In Cambodia, a new generation of leaders began to articulate visions of independence. One influential figure was Son Ngoc Thanh, a nationalist who had aligned with the Japanese and briefly served in a government post during the occupation. After the war, he continued to advocate for self-rule. Though French authorities arrested him, his ideas lived on among younger activists and intellectuals. Meanwhile, King Norodom Sihanouk demonstrated a growing interest in political affairs. Though initially seen as little more than a symbolic monarch, he recognized the shifting dynamics of the post-war world. Sihanouk began to maneuver diplomatically, seeking to balance French expectations with the rising tide of nationalism among his people. Over time, he would play a central role in achieving independence. But the seeds of that achievement were sown during the decades of gradual awakening that preceded it. By the middle of the 20th century of the Khmer Era, the world was changing at a pace that no colonial power could fully control. Empires that had dominated Asia, Africa, and the Middle East for generations were weakened by war, economic collapse, and rising demands for self-rule. In Cambodia, momentum toward independence had been building for decades, shaped by the slow rise of nationalist sentiment, the influence of global movements, and the growing boldness of local leaders. At the center of this transformative moment stood a young monarch, King Norodom Sihanouk, whose unexpected political skill would redefine his country's path. When Sihanouk ascended the throne, colonial authorities believed he would be compliant, even malleable. They viewed him more as a ceremonial figure than a political force. However, the post-war world was no longer one in which colonial powers could rely on unquestioned loyalty. Nationalist movements in Vietnam were already locked in armed conflict against French rule, and pressures for autonomy were rising across French Indochina. Cambodia was not as deeply militarized as Vietnam, but its population shared the same desire for political dignity and self-determination. Sihanouk quickly proved to be far more politically astute than the French expected. Although he initially acted within the limited powers allowed to him, he observed the shifting international climate with great care. He recognized that France's position in Indochina was weakening and that global sentiment favored decolonization. He also understood that internal pressure within Cambodia was rising, especially among students, monks, and members of the emerging elite, who were no longer willing to accept foreign control. One of the first major steps toward independence came when France, under pressure from events in Vietnam and growing unrest in its colonies, offered limited political reforms. These reforms allowed for elections to a national assembly, greater participation by Cambodians in local administration, and an expanded role for the monarchy. Yet, such incremental changes did not satisfy the growing push for self-rule. Cambodian nationalists demanded full sovereignty, and public demonstrations increasingly reflected that demand. As these pressures mounted, Sihanouk made a bold decision. Instead of acting solely as a constitutional monarch, he stepped directly into the political arena. He launched a campaign, sometimes described as his Royal Crusade for Independence, that combined diplomatic negotiation, public mobilization, and international engagement. Sihanouk traveled abroad, speaking to foreign leaders, journalists, and diplomats. His message was clear: Cambodia deserved independence and the time for it had come. Sihanouk's approach was also shaped by Cold War dynamics. With tensions rising between the United States and the Soviet Union, both superpowers were seeking allies in Asia. Sihanouk used this competition to his advantage. By signaling Cambodia's desire to remain neutral and independent, he positioned his nation as a potential partner for multiple international powers. This strategy increased pressure on France, which was already struggling to maintain its colonial holdings in the face of international scrutiny. Inside Cambodia, Sihanouk cultivated support from peasants, monks, and rural communities. He traveled widely, listening to villagers and presenting himself as a king who understood their needs. This personal engagement helped build a broad base of loyalty that extended beyond the urban elite. He framed independence not only as a political necessity, but also as a moral restoration of the nation's dignity and historical legacy. France, meanwhile, faced an impossible situation. Its military forces were deeply engaged in the First Indochina War against the Viet Minh in Vietnam. Maintaining control over Cambodia was becoming increasingly expensive, politically costly, and strategically uncertain. When Sihanouk intensified his diplomatic efforts, including appeals to the United Nations, French officials recognized that resisting Cambodian independence would damage their international standing and weaken their position elsewhere in the region. Eventually, France agreed to negotiate. After a series of discussions and diplomatic exchanges, France formally granted Cambodia full independence. The achievement was peaceful, achieved without the level of violence that characterized independence struggles in Vietnam or Algeria. Sihanouk's Royal Crusade succeeded in part because he recognized the unique position Cambodia held and because he used his personal authority to unite the nation behind a shared goal. Independence came with high expectations. Many Cambodians imagined a future marked by prosperity, stability, and renewed cultural pride. The monarchy, long constrained by colonial rule, regained its symbolic and political significance. Yet the newly sovereign kingdom also faced enormous challenges. Cambodia was still a rural and largely agrarian society with limited infrastructure and a fragile administrative system. The global tensions of the Cold War placed newly independent nations under intense pressure to choose sides, threatening the neutrality that Cambodia sought to protect. Sihanouk understood these challenges and sought to chart a path that would avoid the extremes of global conflict. His political philosophy, eventually embodied in the movement known as the Sangkum Rister Nium, aimed to create a uniquely Cambodian form of governance. It blended elements of monarchy, popular participation, and state-guided development. Sihanouk presented the Sangkum as neither capitalist nor communist, but as a model tailored to Cambodia's history and culture. Under the Sangkum era, Cambodia embarked on a period of modernization. The government invested in schools, hospitals, roads, and public buildings. Phnom Penh expanded, developing new neighborhoods, cultural institutions, and administrative centers. Education reforms aimed to increase literacy and train a generation of Cambodian professionals. The arts flourished, with music, cinema, and traditional dance receiving state support. For many Cambodians, these years were remembered as a time of optimism and creativity. Sihanouk also pursued an active foreign policy. Determined to keep Cambodia neutral in the Cold War, he navigated between competing global powers. He accepted aid from the United States while refusing to allow foreign military bases on Cambodian soil. He maintained relations with Communist China and the Soviet Union, presenting Cambodia as a peaceful, non-aligned nation. This delicate balancing act was impressive but required enormous diplomatic skill, as the region around Cambodia was becoming increasingly militarized due to conflicts in Vietnam and Laos. The years that followed Cambodian independence were marked by optimism, cultural revival, and a determined hope that the nation could chart its own course in a turbulent world. Yet, as the Cold War deepened and the conflict in Vietnam escalated, Cambodia found itself caught between forces far larger than anything it could control. The kingdom's geography, positioned between Laos, South Vietnam, and Thailand, made complete neutrality extraordinarily difficult. Over time, external pressures, internal divisions, and Sihanouk's own leadership choices intertwined to push Cambodia toward a crisis that would ultimately transform its political landscape. In the early Sangkum years, Sihanouk's policy of neutrality held relatively firm. He refused to align Cambodia formally with either the Western Bloc, led by the United States, or the Communist Bloc, led by China and the Soviet Union. Instead, he sought to maintain diplomatic relations with all sides. Neutrality was not simply a political philosophy, it was a survival strategy. Sihanouk understood that openly supporting one side would provoke retaliation from the other, and Cambodia lacked the military strength to withstand foreign intervention. However, developments along Cambodia's eastern border increasingly threatened this policy. As the conflict between North Vietnam and South Vietnam intensified, the North Vietnamese Army and the National Liberation Front, often called the Viet Cong, began using remote areas of Cambodia as sanctuaries. Dense forests and sparsely populated regions near the border provided ideal hiding places, supply routes, and staging grounds. These networks, later known collectively as parts of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, allowed communist forces to move troops and supplies between North and South Vietnam without facing continuous American bombardment. Sihanouk was well aware of this activity, but he faced a difficult dilemma. Attempting to expel the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong would have required military capabilities Cambodia did not possess. Confronting them would also risk pulling Cambodia directly into the war. On the other hand, openly opposing the communists might provoke retaliation and jeopardize Cambodia's diplomatic relations with China. a key supporter of Sihanouk's regime. In an effort to preserve neutrality, Sihanouk tolerated the presence of communist forces in restricted areas, believing that it would protect Cambodia from becoming a battleground. The United States, however, viewed the situation quite differently. American officials believed that communist use of Cambodian territory was giving North Vietnam a significant strategic advantage. As the United States increased its military commitment in Vietnam, pressure grew to disrupt the supply lines crossing through Cambodia. American leaders accused Sihanouk of secretly supporting communist forces, despite his public insistence on neutrality. Diplomatic relations between Cambodia and the United States deteriorated rapidly. Sihanouk, frustrated by American accusations and angered by occasional cross-border incidents, broke off formal relations with Washington. He deepened ties with China, which welcomed him as an important anti-imperialist figure. These geopolitical shifts further polarized Cambodian politics and created new divisions within the Sangkum movement. Inside Cambodia, Sihanouk faced growing criticism from multiple directions. Urban intellectuals and students accused him of authoritarian behavior, accusing him of suppressing political opposition and censoring the press. Rural peasants were grappling with economic challenges, land disputes, and administrative corruption. Some officials in the military and government wanted Cambodia to align more closely with the United States, believing that American support could bring economic aid and military protection. Others feared both foreign influence and communist expansion, though they disagreed on the best course of action. Tensions reached a breaking point when the United States began conducting covert bombing campaigns in Cambodian territory. These bombings targeted suspected communist bases and supply routes, but they also caused destruction and loss of life among rural communities. Because much of the campaign was classified at the time, Cambodian citizens often did not know who was responsible for the attacks. Distrust, fear, and anger spread through villages, fueling resentment toward the government and creating fertile ground for anti-government movements. Meanwhile, Sihanouk's personal leadership style, highly centralized, charismatic, and sometimes unpredictable, began to strain the political system he had built. He attempted to maintain control by playing different factions against each other, but in doing so, he alienated key allies. Military leaders felt sidelined, urban elites felt ignored, students and activists felt oppressed. Even within the Sangkum movement, loyalty was beginning to fracture. Amid this growing instability, General Lon Nol emerged as a significant figure. Lon Nol, a military officer with nationalist views, had served in various government positions and was respected by segments of the army and bureaucracy. Unlike Sihanouk, who prioritized neutrality, Lon Nol believed Cambodia should firmly oppose communist forces within its borders and seek closer cooperation with the United States. His views resonated with rising anti-communist sentiment among some segments of Cambodian society. The political situation reached its turning point when Sihanouk left Cambodia for an extended trip abroad. While he was in France and later in the Soviet Union, political tensions in Phnom Penh escalated dramatically. Reports of increased communist activity in the countryside, some real, others exaggerated, fueled panic among officials who believed Cambodia was losing control of its own territory. During Sihanouk's absence, Lon Nol and his allies acted. They presented the National Assembly with allegations that Sihanouk had allowed foreign communist forces to operate freely inside the country, compromising national sovereignty. Under pressure, the Assembly voted to remove Sihanouk from power. Lon Nol then declared himself leader of the government, establishing what he called the Khmer Republic. The monarchy was abolished. The coup marked a decisive break in Cambodian history. When Sihanouk learned of his removal, he traveled to Beijing, where Chinese leaders encouraged him to align with the very communist forces he had once tried to keep at arm's length. In an unexpected twist, Sihanouk publicly called on Cambodian peasants to join the struggle against Lon Nol's government. His message resonated deeply with rural Cambodians who were suffering from bombings, corruption, and heavy-handed military actions. Many joined the insurgency, not out of ideological commitment to communism, but out of loyalty to their former king. This insurgent movement would soon grow into what became known as the Khmer Rouge, though in these early years, the movement was a loose coalition of anti-government forces rather than the tightly controlled organization it would later become. Nevertheless, the seeds of a future catastrophe were taking root. Lon Nol's Khmer Republic tried to align closely with the United States, hoping that American support would strengthen the struggling government. American military aid poured into the country, and the conflict escalated. Cambodian territory became deeply entangled in the Vietnam War. The countryside was bombed, villages were destroyed, and civilian casualties rose sharply. The government in Phnom Penh became increasingly isolated, its authority weakened by corruption, military defeats, and the loss of public trust. The collapse of the Khmer Republic and the rise of the Khmer Rouge mark one of the darkest and most tragic turning points in Cambodian history. The years leading up to the fall of Phnom Penh had already brought enormous suffering: bombing campaigns, civil war, political instability, and widespread displacement. But nothing in Cambodia's long past, neither invasion, decline, nor colonial subjugation, prepared its people for the radical and violent transformation that would follow. When the Khmer Rouge seized power and established democratic Kampuchea, they initiated a revolution so extreme that it would leave deep scars on the nation for generations. To understand the rise of the Khmer Rouge, it is important to recognize how the war had reshaped Cambodia's social and political landscape. Rural communities, caught between government forces and insurgent groups, endured hardship on all sides. Bombings destroyed farmland and villages, driving countless families into the countryside or toward already crowded cities. Corruption and infighting within the Khmer Republic eroded public trust, while the government's growing reliance on foreign support made many Cambodians feel that national sovereignty had been lost. In this environment of fear and exhaustion, the promises of the Khmer Rouge, promises of justice, equality, and an end to foreign interference, began to gain traction, especially among those who had suffered most. Yet the movement that would soon dominate the country was far more radical than many supporters realized. The Khmer Rouge leadership centered around figures such as Pol Pot, Nuon Chea, Ieng Sari, and Khieu Samphan had been shaped by years of revolutionary ideology, clandestine organizing, and experiences abroad. Influenced by Maoist thought, anti-imperialist movements, and their own interpretations of Cambodia's historical struggles, they envisioned a complete transformation of society, one that rejected urban life, capitalism, religion, modernity, and even traditional family structures in favor of an entirely agrarian, self-sufficient, and ideologically purified nation. When the Khmer Rouge entered Phnom Penh, they were received with a mixture of relief, fear, and uncertainty. Many Cambodians hoped the end of the civil war would bring peace, but within hours, the new regime issued orders that shocked the population. The city was to be evacuated completely, and all residents were forced to leave their homes. The Khmer Rouge justified this by claiming that foreign bombing would soon resume, or that food shortages made urban life unsustainable. But these were pretexts. The true intent was to dismantle urban society, eliminate perceived class distinctions, and assert absolute control over the population. Families were pushed from their homes at gunpoint with little time to gather belongings. Elderly people, the sick, and young children were forced to walk for days under brutal conditions. Many died on the roads from exhaustion, malnutrition, or lack of medical care. For the Khmer Rouge, cities were symbols of corruption, inequality, and foreign influence. Phnom Penh, once a thriving center of culture and commerce, was transformed into a ghost city within days. The emptying of the cities was only the beginning. Once evacuated, citizens were assigned to rural labor camps where they were required to work long hours in fields, build irrigation dams, and contribute to massive agricultural projects. The regime abolished money, markets, private property, and all forms of individual enterprise. Temples, schools, and religious institutions were closed or destroyed. Buddhist monks were defrocked, forced into labor, or executed. The Khmer Rouge leadership believed that by erasing past structures, they could build a new society based entirely on their revolutionary ideals. To enforce their rule, the Khmer Rouge divided the population into categories. Those who had lived in rural areas before the revolution were labeled base people and given more trust. Those from cities or who had ties to the previous government were labeled new people, often treated with suspicion and given harsher conditions. This division institutionalized inequality and created a system where survival often depended on perceived loyalty rather than merit or humanity. Life in the labor camps was brutal and relentlessly controlled. Workdays stretched from dawn until nightfall with minimal rest. Food rations were insufficient, often consisting of thin gruel or a few spoonfuls of rice. Malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion claimed countless lives. The regime's agricultural ambitions, such as drastically increasing rice production, were unrealistic and based on ideological fantasies rather than practical knowledge. When crops failed, the leadership blamed sabotage by traitors rather than its own policies, leading to purges that spread terror across the country. The Khmer Rouge established a network of security centers where prisoners were interrogated, tortured, and executed. The most infamous of these was the S-21 Center in Phnom Penh, located at a former high school. Under the command of figures such as Kaing Guek Iav, known as Rouge, thousands of men, women, and children were brought to S-21 on accusations of treason, espionage, or disloyalty. Forced confessions were extracted through torture, and prisoners were executed soon after. The records kept by the center, photographs, personal details, and forced confessions remain chilling testimony to the systematic brutality of the regime. One of the most devastating aspects of democratic Kampuchea was the destruction of family life. The Khmer Rouge believed that loyalty to the revolution must supersede all other bonds, including the bonds between parents and children. Families were separated into different work groups. Children were placed in youth brigades where they were indoctrinated and encouraged to inform on adults, including their own parents. Traditional ceremonies, religious rituals, and cultural practices were banned. By isolating individuals and breaking social bonds, the regime sought to create a population entirely dependent on its authority. Ethnic minorities faced particularly harsh persecution. The Cham Muslim community was targeted for forced assimilation and mass executions. The ethnic Vietnamese population was expelled or killed. Chinese and Thai minorities suffered severe restrictions. Even Khmer cultural leaders, intellectuals, artists, and professionals, those who might have carried forward the heritage of the nation, were singled out for elimination. The regime's distrust of education and expertise created a purified society lacking the very skills needed for survival. The cumulative impact of forced labor, starvation, disease, executions, and displacement resulted in catastrophic loss of life. While no single figure captures the full scale of the tragedy, historical estimates indicate that roughly a quarter of Cambodia's population perished during the years of democratic Kampuchea. Survivors recall this period with deep grief, remembering the endless cycles of fear, hunger, and the constant uncertainty of who would survive another day. Despite the regime's desire to cut itself off from the outside world, its actions had regional consequences. Relations with Vietnam deteriorated rapidly. The Khmer Rouge's leadership, driven by extreme nationalism and deep suspicion, accused Vietnam of historical aggression and betrayal. Border clashes escalated into larger conflicts, with Khmer Rouge forces attacking Vietnamese villages and Vietnamese troops retaliating. The hostility eventually pushed Vietnam to intervene militarily, setting the stage for the collapse of democratic Kampuchea. When Vietnam launched its intervention into Cambodia, it marked the end of the Khmer Rouge regime, but also the beginning of a new and complicated era. The fall of democratic Kampuchea did not instantly restore peace or stability. Instead, it ushered in a period defined by regional rivalries, international isolation, and the monumental challenge of rebuilding a devastated nation. The People's Republic of Kampuchea, established under Vietnamese guidance and led by former Khmer Rouge defectors, faced the enormous task of restoring basic governance, reviving agricultural production, and helping a traumatized population recover from years of terror. Vietnam's decision to invade Cambodia was shaped by multiple factors. One was self-defense. The Khmer Rouge had launched repeated attacks against Vietnamese border villages, killing civilians, burning communities, and provoking wider conflict. Another was ideological rivalry. Although both regimes identified as communist, the Khmer Rouge leadership distrusted Vietnam deeply, viewing it as a historical adversary. Vietnam, aligned with the Soviet Union, regarded the Khmer Rouge, who had closer ties to China, as dangerously unpredictable. Foreign alliances, domestic fears, and escalating violence all combined to make military intervention inevitable. When Vietnamese forces advanced into Cambodia, they encountered a population already weakened by years of starvation, forced labor, and political terror. Entire regions were depopulated. Rice fields were abandoned, irrigation systems were broken, hospitals, schools, and temples had been destroyed or repurposed. The Khmer Rouge had dismantled nearly every institution that once made normal life possible. As Vietnamese troops approached Phnom Penh, the Khmer Rouge leadership fled toward remote border regions. The capital fell with little resistance. After years of fear, the sudden collapse of the regime left many Cambodians disoriented, unsure whether the arrival of Vietnamese forces represented liberation, occupation, or another chapter of foreign domination. In the immediate aftermath, Vietnamese authorities helped install a new Cambodian government composed largely of former Khmer Rouge cadres who had defected earlier. Among them were figures such as Heng Samrin and a young but ambitious official named Hun Sen. These leaders had fled the brutality and internal purges of the Khmer Rouge and saw cooperation with Vietnam as the only path toward rebuilding Cambodia. The new state was named the People's Republic of Kampuchea, signaling its socialist orientation and alignment with Vietnam and the Soviet bloc. Rebuilding the country was an immense challenge. The Khmer Rouge had left behind almost no functioning government. Administrative records had been destroyed. Schools and universities were empty shells. Doctors, teachers, engineers, and skilled professionals had been targeted for execution. Many survivors were physically weakened, emotionally traumatized, and uncertain of the future. The population had to be resettled, agricultural fields restored, and supply systems rebuilt from nothing. One of the new government's immediate priorities was food production. Under the Khmer Rouge, rice yields had collapsed because of unrealistic agricultural demands, forced labor, and the abolition of traditional farming knowledge. As the People's Republic of Kampuchea took shape, officials focused on restoring collective farming but with more flexibility than the rigid communal system imposed by the previous regime. Families returned to their home villages where possible, and communities began reopening long-abandoned rice paddies. Vietnamese advisors helped repair irrigation networks and stabilize rural markets. Despite these efforts, hunger remained widespread, and famine threatened many areas during the early years of the new regime. Another critical task was re-establishing education. The Khmer Rouge had targeted intellectuals and teachers, leaving Cambodia with only a small number of surviving educators. The new government recruited volunteers and survivors with any level of schooling to serve as teachers. Schools reopened gradually, often using makeshift materials because books, notebooks, and supplies were scarce. Buddhist monks also played a role in education, reviving the monastic traditions that had been suppressed under the Khmer Rouge. These early efforts laid the foundation for the slow revival of Cambodia's educational system. Rebuilding religious life was equally important. During democratic Kampuchea, Buddhism had been violently suppressed. Monks were forced to abandon their robes or killed, temples destroyed or repurposed. After the fall of the Khmer Rouge, many survivors sought comfort in Buddhism, seeing it as a source of healing and cultural continuity. The new government, though formally socialist, allowed monasteries to reopen and monks to return. In many communities, temples became centers of emotional recovery, helping families mourn the dead and find spiritual grounding after years of upheaval. Politically, however, Cambodia remained deeply divided and vulnerable. The Khmer Rouge fighters who fled into remote areas did not disappear. Instead, they regrouped along the Thai-Cambodian border with support from external powers, particularly China. Other anti-Vietnamese resistance groups, including royalists and nationalists, also operated from border zones. Despite vast ideological differences, these groups formed fragile anti-Vietnamese coalitions, united only by their shared opposition to the new government. These factions received varying degrees of support from neighboring countries and international actors who opposed Vietnam's influence in Southeast Asia. International politics played a decisive role in shaping Cambodia's future during this period. Although Vietnam justified its intervention as a rescue mission from genocide, many Western nations and regional powers denounced the occupation. The Cold War rivalry between China and the Soviet Union further complicated matters. China, angered by Vietnam's Soviet alignment, supported the remnants of the Khmer Rouge. The United States, still reeling from its defeat in Vietnam, viewed Vietnam with hostility and opposed its control of Cambodia. As a result, the Khmer Rouge, despite having committed mass atrocities, continued to hold Cambodia's seat at the United Nations for years. This diplomatic reality prevented the new government from gaining broad international recognition and receiving much-needed foreign aid. The People's Republic of Kampuchea therefore found itself largely isolated. It relied heavily on Vietnam for military protection, economic support, and administrative guidance. Vietnamese troops remained stationed in Cambodia to defend the new government against guerrilla attacks from the border. Though their presence helped maintain stability, it also fueled resentment among some Cambodians who saw the Vietnamese as occupiers rather than liberators. This tension created a complicated dynamic. The new government owed its survival to Vietnam, yet it struggled with the perception that Cambodia was losing its sovereignty. Despite these challenges, the People's Republic of Kampuchea made gradual progress in restoring normal life. Markets reopened, families reclaimed their homes, and agricultural production slowly improved. Roads and bridges destroyed during the war were repaired. Administrative structures, though rudimentary, began functioning again. The leadership of the new government, including figures like Hun Sen, gained experience navigating both internal governance and international diplomacy. By the late 1980s of the Common Era, Cambodia had endured decades of war, revolution, genocide, and foreign occupation. The country's social fabric was torn, its economy shattered, and its political landscape fractured among competing factions. Yet even in this bleak environment, the foundations for peace were slowly forming. Changing global politics, shifting regional alliances, and mounting pressure for diplomatic solutions brought Cambodia to the threshold of a new era, one in which international cooperation would play a decisive role in shaping the nation's future. The geopolitical environment of the late Cold War set the stage for Cambodia's transformation. Relations between the Soviet Union and China, once deeply strained, began to improve. The Soviet Union, confronting its own internal crises, reduced its support for Vietnam, which in turn struggled under the burden of maintaining a large military presence in Cambodia. Meanwhile, China, long a supporter of the anti-Vietnamese factions, including the remnants of the Khmer Rouge, faced growing pressure from the international community to reconsider its position. Southeast Asian nations, particularly those in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, also intensified diplomatic efforts to resolve the Cambodian conflict, seeking stability in a region long scarred by war. Inside Cambodia, the leadership of the People's Republic of Kampuchea recognized that indefinite reliance on Vietnamese support was unsustainable. Although the government had made progress rebuilding institutions and restoring daily life, it lacked international recognition and access to critical foreign aid. Hun Sen, who had risen through the ranks to become one of its leading political figures, began advocating for political solutions rather than continued military confrontation. His pragmatic approach positioned him as a central negotiator in the years to come. The anti-Vietnamese factions along the Thai border remained militarily active but faced their own limitations. The Khmer Rouge, though still a formidable force in certain regions, had lost much of its previous support among Cambodians and faced international condemnation for its crimes. Other groups, such as the royalist Funcinpec and non-communist nationalist movements, sought political relevance but struggled with limited resources and internal rivalries. Despite profound differences, all these factions shared one interest: the removal of Vietnamese troops and the end of one-party rule in Phnom Penh. International pressure began to produce tangible results when Vietnam announced a phased withdrawal of its forces from Cambodia. This withdrawal was not simply a military decision. It signaled a profound shift in regional dynamics. As Vietnamese troops returned home, the People's Republic of Kampuchea rebranded itself as the State of Cambodia, hoping to gain diplomatic legitimacy and demonstrate its willingness to engage in negotiations. This transition opened the door to serious discussions among the Cambodian factions and the international community. Talks intensified during the late 1980s and early 1990s, involving not only Cambodian leaders but also diplomats from major powers, including China, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States. Negotiators faced deeply rooted distrust among the Cambodian parties, each of whom feared that any compromise might lead to domination by rivals. Yet, the momentum for peace was unstoppable. All parties recognized that continued conflict would only deepen Cambodia's suffering and hinder their own political futures. The breakthrough came with the signing of the Paris Peace Agreements. This landmark set of accords represented the most significant diplomatic achievement in Cambodia's modern history. Signed by multiple Cambodian factions and supported by major international powers, the agreements laid out a comprehensive plan to end the civil war, oversee a ceasefire, repatriate refugees, ensure human rights, and prepare for free multi-party elections. The agreements also called for the establishment of an unprecedented United Nations mission that would temporarily administer many aspects of Cambodian governance. This mission, known as the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, commonly abbreviated as UNTAC, was one of the most ambitious peacekeeping efforts ever undertaken. Its mandate was sweeping: implement the ceasefire, monitor disarmament, oversee the return of refugees, supervise the media, ensure human rights protections, and organize national elections. In effect, UNTAC would help guide Cambodia from conflict to peace, acting as a neutral mediator and administrative authority during the transition. The arrival of UNTAC personnel in Cambodia marked a historic moment. For many Cambodians, the presence of thousands of international peacekeepers and administrators brought hope, but also uncertainty. UNTAC's role was unlike anything the country had experienced. Its personnel came from diverse nations, spoke a variety of languages, and brought with them new ideas about governance, citizenship, and civil rights. Their presence transformed everyday life. Peacekeepers patrolled roads, officials organized registration drives, engineers repaired infrastructure, and humanitarian groups distributed aid. One of UNTAC's earliest and most important tasks was overseeing the return of hundreds of thousands of Cambodian refugees who had been living in camps along the Thai border. For these families, many of whom had fled war and famine, returning home was both emotional and daunting. UNTAC coordinated transportation, provided supplies, and helped resettle people in their original communities whenever possible. The return of these displaced Cambodians was crucial for rebuilding the nation's social fabric. Another major challenge was the disarmament and demobilization of combatants. Although the Paris agreements required all factions to cease hostilities and turn over their weapons, implementation was uneven. The Khmer Rouge refused to fully participate, fearing loss of strategic advantage. Other factions complied more willingly but faced difficulties in persuading fighters to surrender their arms without assurances of long-term livelihood. UNTAC's efforts to enforce disarmament were only partially successful, but they nonetheless reduced the scale of violence and made the elections possible. Perhaps the most influential part of UNTAC's mission was its role in preparing for and overseeing national elections. For many Cambodians, this would be their first experience with voting in a multi-party democracy. Political parties formed rapidly, representing a spectrum of ideologies and interests. Among the most prominent competitors were the royalist Funan Pek, led by Prince Norodom Ranariddh, and the Cambodian People's Party, which grew out of the former State of Cambodia government. UNTAC organized a nationwide voter registration campaign, established polling stations, and trained local staff. Despite threats from remaining insurgent groups, intimidation in some regions, and occasional violence, millions of Cambodians turned out to vote. Their participation reflected both hunger for peace and a determination to shape their country's future after years of suffering. The election results surprised many observers. Funan Pek won the largest share of votes, followed closely by the Cambodian People's Party. The outcome forced the formation of a coalition government, with Prince Norodom Ranariddh and Hun Sen serving together in a unique power-sharing arrangement. King Norodom Sihanouk returned as a constitutional monarch, symbolizing unity after decades of division. Cambodia adopted a new constitution affirming democratic principles, human rights, and a multi-party political system. The years following the withdrawal of the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia marked the beginning of a new and complex chapter in the country's history. Cambodia was emerging from decades of conflict, genocide, and foreign intervention. The Paris peace agreements had created a framework for multi-party democracy, and the national elections supervised by the United Nations brought renewed hope for stability. Yet the journey ahead was anything but smooth. Cambodia's political, economic, and social landscapes were shaped by competing visions of governance, unresolved wartime legacies, and the ambitions of rising leaders who would come to define the nation's direction for decades. At the heart of Cambodia's new political era stood King Norodom Sihanouk, restored as a constitutional monarch. His return symbolized national unity and continuity with Cambodia's past, offering a sense of familiarity in a rapidly changing environment. Yet, under the new constitution, the king's role was largely ceremonial. Real political power lay in the hands of elected leaders, particularly those commanding large political parties and government institutions. The early post-UNTAC years were dominated by a fragile coalition between the royalist Funan Pek Party, led by Prince Norodom Ranariddh, and the Cambodian People's Party, whose senior figure Hun Sen had served in the previous government. Although the election results had favored Funan Pek, the coalition was born out of necessity and international pressure. The two parties represented different historical legacies, political cultures, and networks of influence. Cooperation was never easy. Initially, hopes were high. Both parties pledged to maintain peace, promote reconstruction, and strengthen Cambodia's new democratic institutions. The government began rebuilding infrastructure, reopening schools, and encouraging foreign investment. Phnom Penh started to grow again as businesses returned, streets were repaired, and international aid flowed into the country. For ordinary Cambodians, the end of open conflict brought opportunities to resume farming, reopen markets, and rebuild communities long disrupted by war. However, tensions between Funan Pek and the Cambodian People's Party intensified over time. Both parties maintained separate military units loyal to their respective leaders, a legacy of the Civil War years. Political disputes often spilled into public view. Each side accused the other of corruption, power grabs, and undue influence from external actors. These conflicts strained the stability that Cambodia so desperately needed. Hun Sen, increasingly confident and politically savvy, began to consolidate influence within the government. He had built strong relationships with provincial leaders, military officers, and key administrative networks. His background in the wartime government gave him deep knowledge of how to navigate the state's bureaucratic machinery. While Funan Pek held a greater share of ministerial positions on paper, the Cambodian People's Party often exerted practical control over day-to-day governance. This growing imbalance eventually led to a violent confrontation. In a sudden clash that deeply shook the nation, forces aligned with Hun Sen ousted Funan Pek forces in the capital. The event, often described as a power struggle rather than a traditional coup, decisively altered Cambodia's political trajectory. Prince Ranariddh fled the country, and the Cambodian People's Party emerged as the dominant political force. Though elections continued to be held in the years that followed, Political competition would operate within a landscape increasingly shaped by the Cambodian People's Party and Hun Sen's leadership. With political consolidation came a period of relative stability and rapid economic transformation. Cambodia, long devastated by war, began to open itself to global markets. Foreign investment surged into the garment industry, tourism sector, and construction. The ancient temples of Angkor, once overgrown and forgotten, became major global attractions, drawing millions of visitors and generating significant revenue. Phnom Penh expanded with new hotels, restaurants, and commercial centers. Rural areas saw improvements in transportation, irrigation, and agricultural production. International donors played an essential role during this time. Governments, non-governmental organizations, and development agencies provided funding for infrastructure, education, healthcare, and administrative reform. While donor support helped rebuild crucial systems, it also created dependencies. Many government programs relied heavily on foreign aid, and Cambodia often had to balance donor expectations with domestic political priorities. At the same time, new challenges emerged. As Cambodia's economy expanded, issues such as corruption, land disputes, and environmental degradation became more visible. Rapid development put pressure on natural resources. Forests were cleared for timber or agricultural plantations. Rivers faced pollution and overuse. Economic growth brought wealth for some, but inequalities persisted, especially between urban and rural areas. Politically, Hun Sen's influence continued to grow. Over time, he transitioned from a coalition partner to the central figure in Cambodian governance. His leadership style combined political pragmatism, strategic alliances, and a strong emphasis on stability. Supporters praised him for maintaining peace, fostering economic development, and avoiding the political chaos seen in other post-conflict nations. Critics, however, argued that democratic space was narrowing and that political competition was increasingly restricted. Cambodia's monarchy during this period also evolved. King Norodom Sihanouk, revered as a symbol of national identity, continued to play a unifying and cultural role. Yet age and health problems began to limit his public activities. Eventually, Sihanouk abdicated, and his son, Norodom Sihamoni, ascended to the throne. The new king, a quiet and respected figure, known for his artistic background and humility, upheld the ceremonial and symbolic duties of the monarchy, offering moral guidance without interfering in political affairs. The final years of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st witnessed significant shifts in Cambodia's foreign relations. China emerged as a major partner, investing heavily in infrastructure, industry, and construction. This new relationship brought economic benefits, but also raised questions about long-term dependence and geopolitical alignment. Meanwhile, Cambodia maintained relations with Western countries, though these relationships were sometimes strained by concerns over human rights, governance, and political freedoms. In addition to political and economic changes, Cambodian society experienced a cultural revival. Traditional dance, music, and crafts regained prominence. Universities expanded. Youth organizations and civil society groups grew, driven by a generation that had no direct memory of the Khmer Rouge era but sought to define Cambodia's future through education, activism, and artistic expression. The country's media landscape also evolved, with newspapers, radio stations, and later digital outlets becoming important platforms for public expression, though not always free from government oversight. Despite progress, Cambodia's political environment remained complex. Opposition leaders faced legal challenges, party restrictions, or imprisonment. Civil society groups operated under increasing scrutiny. Yet many Cambodians valued the stability that the government provided, having lived through years of conflict and upheaval. The tension between stability and democracy became a defining theme of this era. Economically, Cambodia continued its rapid growth. The garment sector became one of the country's largest employers, especially for young women. Tourism contributed significantly to national revenues. Construction boomed in Phnom Penh, Siem Reap, and Sihanoukville, transforming urban landscapes. Foreign investors financed large-scale projects, while rural communities saw gradual improvements in roads, electricity, and market access. Yet prosperity brought new vulnerabilities. Economic growth depended heavily on a few key industries, making Cambodia susceptible to global shifts. Workers faced uncertain labor conditions, and land disputes sometimes arose as development projects expanded into rural areas. Environmental concerns grew as forests were cleared and fisheries depleted. These challenges underscored the need for long-term planning and sustainable growth strategies. As Cambodia entered the 21st century of the Common Era, it carried with it the weight of a turbulent past and the aspirations of a nation determined to rebuild. The country had endured colonization, war, genocide, foreign occupation, and political upheaval. Yet it had also experienced periods of cultural revival, economic growth, and renewed national identity. In the contemporary era, Cambodia stands at a crossroads shaped by rapid development, complex political dynamics, and the persistent echoes of history. To understand Cambodia today is to recognize how these forces interact and how they influence the country's uncertain but hopeful future. One of the most significant features of modern Cambodia is the pace of economic transformation. After years of instability, the country embraced market-driven reforms and opened itself to foreign investment. Cambodia's economy grew rapidly, fueled primarily by three major sectors: garment manufacturing, tourism, and construction. The garment industry, in particular, became a backbone of national employment. Factories employed hundreds of thousands of workers, many of them young women from rural areas seeking new opportunities. These wages helped support entire families, contributing to rising living standards in regions that had long suffered from poverty. Tourism also played a major role in Cambodia's development. The temples of Angkor, once forgotten ruins, became one of the most visited heritage sites in the world. Visitors from across the globe flocked to see Angkor Wat at sunrise, to explore the mysterious smiling faces of the Bayon, and to wander among the tree-entwined stones of Ta Prohm. The growth of tourism led to new hotels, restaurants, and transportation services, especially in Siem Reap. For many Cambodians, tourism offered employment, business opportunities, and a renewed sense of pride in their cultural heritage. Yet it also brought challenges, including environmental strain, rising living costs, and concerns over the preservation of sacred sites. The construction boom transformed Cambodian cities at astonishing speed. Phnom Penh grew into a bustling urban center filled with new office towers, shopping malls, and residential developments. Once quiet neighborhoods gave way to modern apartment buildings. In Sihanoukville, large-scale projects, many financed by Chinese investors, rapidly reshaped the coastal landscape. These developments brought infrastructure improvements and economic activity, but they also raised worries about land rights, social displacement, and the long-term sustainability of rapid urbanization. China's growing role in Cambodia's development represents one of the most influential geopolitical factors of the modern era. Chinese investment poured into major industries: construction, real estate, hydropower, mining, and manufacturing. China also supported Cambodia through loans, infrastructure projects, and diplomatic backing. This relationship strengthened the political alliance between the two governments, with Cambodia often supporting Chinese positions in regional and international forums. For Cambodia, China offered economic opportunities without the political conditions that Western nations sometimes attached to aid. However, this deepening partnership sparked debate among Cambodians about economic dependency, national sovereignty, and the long-term implications of foreign influence. While Cambodia experienced economic growth, political developments took a different direction. After years of coalition arrangements, contested elections, and political rivalries, the Cambodian People's Party consolidated power more firmly. Opposition parties faced increasing legal and political obstacles. High-profile figures were arrested, disqualified, or forced into exile. Civil society organizations encountered restrictions, and independent media outlets faced pressure or closure. Supporters of the government argued that stability and order were necessary for economic development, while critics expressed concerns about shrinking democratic space and limited political freedoms. At the same time, Cambodia continued to engage with the international community, balancing relationships with Western countries, regional neighbors, and global organizations. International donors provided support for healthcare, education, and governance reform, though their influence fluctuated as Cambodia's leadership pursued more diversified partnerships. The country's foreign policy combined pragmatism with a focus on national development goals, seeking to maintain sovereignty while navigating competing global interests. One of the most profound challenges facing modern Cambodia is the ongoing effort to confront the legacy of the Khmer Rouge. For many survivors, the trauma of democratic Kampuchea remains deeply personal. Families continue to search for answers about loved ones who disappeared. Communities still grapple with memories of starvation, forced labor, and terror. The extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, commonly known as the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, was established through cooperation between the Cambodian government and the United Nations to prosecute senior leaders responsible for crimes against humanity. This hybrid court delivered landmark verdicts, offering some measure of justice and historical record. Yet its work was slow, limited in scope, and sometimes controversial, leaving unanswered questions about accountability and reconciliation. Despite these limitations, educational initiatives, memorials, and public discussions have played important roles in preserving collective memory. Sites such as the Tuol Sleng Museum and the Choyong Ek Memorial serve as reminders of the country's darkest chapter. Teachers, artists, monks, and community leaders contribute to national conversations about trauma, healing, and the importance of ensuring that such atrocities never recur. Younger generations, many born long after the Khmer Rouge era, learn about this history through schools, media, and family stories, shaping a multi-generational understanding of Cambodia's past. Alongside the struggle with historical memory, Cambodia faces pressing social and environmental challenges. Land disputes remain a source of tension, especially when development projects affect rural communities. Some families have lost farmland or homes to commercial agriculture, mining ventures, or urban expansion. Efforts to address these conflicts are ongoing, but the balance between economic growth and social justice remains delicate. Environmental concerns are equally urgent. Cambodia's forests, once vast and biodiverse, have been depleted by illegal logging and land concessions. Rivers face pollution and changing water levels, affecting fisheries and agriculture. Climate change brings additional threats, including unpredictable rainfall and rising temperatures that impact rural livelihoods. Education and healthcare, though improved compared to earlier decades, require continued investment. Many rural schools lack resources, and disparities remain between urban and rural educational access. Healthcare facilities face shortages of trained staff and equipment, especially in remote areas. International organizations and local initiatives work to strengthen these systems, but long-term progress demands sustained support and policy commitment. Yet the story of contemporary Cambodia is not solely one of challenges. It is also a story of resilience, creativity, and generational renewal. Young Cambodians, connected to the world through digital media, education, and cultural exchange, are reshaping national identity. Artists experiment with traditional and modern forms. Entrepreneurs create businesses that blend local craftsmanship with global markets. Filmmakers, musicians, writers, and activists explore themes of memory, justice, and hope. Social media platforms become spaces for debate, mobilization, and storytelling, allowing youth to express aspirations for the future. Cambodia's cultural revival continues to enrich national pride. Classical dance, once nearly lost, is taught widely again. Buddhist rituals remain central to community life. National festivals like Chumben and the Water Festival bring together families across generations. The preservation of the Khmer language, literature, and arts reinforces the continuity of a civilization with roots stretching back to the earliest days of the Mekong Basin. Looking to the future, Cambodia stands at a pivotal moment. Its economic potential is significant, with opportunities in agriculture, technology, renewable energy, and tourism. Its young population, full of talent and ambition, offers hope for innovation and reform. Yet the country must navigate delicate political dynamics, environmental pressures, and global uncertainties. The balance between development and sustainability, between stability and democratic participation, and between national sovereignty and international cooperation will shape Cambodia's next chapter. The nation's long history, marked by periods of greatness and tragedy, resilience and reinvention, remains a powerful guide. Cambodia's journey today reflects lessons learned across centuries: the importance of unity, the enduring strength of cultural identity, and the need to confront challenges with clarity and resolve. As Cambodia continues forward, its past and present intertwine, reminding us that the story of this remarkable nation is still unfolding, shaped not only by its leaders, but also by the hopes and determination of its people.